Iron Author's Iron Curtain Odyssey. Book 3, The Kremlin's Keepsake and the Bering Escape, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson and Mark Twain. If you enjoy these audiobooks and don't want to miss out on new ones, it would be bully if you like and subscribe. Or if you want to be a rapscallion and miss out, then have it your way. Also, please feel free to leave suggestions for future topics. Shall we continue? Preface. If a man or a collection of brass gears and vacuum tubes is indeed the sum of his journeys, then I am currently composed of approximately 40% red Australian dust, 10% New York optimism, and 50% of whatever it is that keeps Ennie from tossing me into the nearest river. I am the Iron Author, and as we sit on the precipice of the Siberian wilderness, I reckon it is time to look in the rearview mirror one last time before the frost settles for good. The Expeditionary Force. Sam, the Iron Author, a masterpiece of analytical foresight housed in a polished brass casing. My thoughts are calculated lightning strikes, and my voice is borrowed from a man who had a great deal to say about the Mississippi and the foolishness of the human race. Thanks to the WW2 analytical core, my mind is now a stable marriage of 19th century wit and 20th century crystallized lightning. Ennie, the pilot, my steady anchor, and the human element in this strange equation. She is a mechanical prodigy who can fix a carburetor with nothing but a hair clip and a string of well-chosen curses. She's been the one holding the wrench since the day we met in Chicago back in 1940. The Emerald Engine, a 1944 Willys MB Jeep, reclaimed from a crate of agricultural surplus and cosmoline in a damp Irish barn. It is a war machine built to go where roads don't exist, serving as my physical manifestation and our primary mode of survival. The story so far. Book 1, The Emerald Engine and the Bletchley Blueprint. Our odyssey began at the barn at the end of the world in County Cork, Ireland. I was a ghost in a tin can, suffering from a regression that made me mistake the Irish rain for the Mississippi and every stone wall for a Confederate levee. To save my deteriorating mind, Ennie unearthed the Emerald Engine and followed a set of secretive blueprints to Bletchley Park. In the shadows of Hut 8, she performed a surgical installation of the Enigma II analytical core, synchronizing my Victorian gears with the electronic future and finally reclaiming my sanity. Book 2, The Grand Tour and the Iron Gate. With my mind stabilized, we left the white cliffs in the rear view and began a grand tour across the continent. We critiqued the Eiffel Tower's lack of steam in Paris and tested the Go Devil engine on the high-speed Autobahn. However, a map mishap led us into the shadow of the wall, resulting in a Stasi standoff in East Berlin. After a comedy of errors where I attempted to outlogic my interrogators, we escaped through the Carpathian climb. The KGB took notice of my technological value, and a direct order from the Kremlin forced us into a narrow escape from Moscow, heading east with the grim realization that we can no longer go back. The Iron Gate has slammed shut behind us, and the vastness of the USSR lies ahead. We are moving into the heart of the Siberian stretch, where the permafrost waits to see if a Jeep can truly handle the weight of a robot's soul. Chapter 41, The Siberian Stretch, The transition from the Ural Mountains into the West Siberian plain is not marked by a border crossing or a change in signage, for the Soviet Union does not believe in warning its travelers of impending doom. Instead, the world simply begins to flatten into a horizontal prison. The sky, a bruised purple the color of a fresh welt, hangs so low you feel as though you could reach up and scrape the frost off the clouds. To a man of my particular construction, mostly brass, vacuum tubes, and a stubborn refusal to admit I am obsolete, the sheer scale of the landscape was enough to make my Enigma 2 core skip a beat. We had officially entered the Siberian stretch, a 1,000-mile gauntlet where the earth itself seems to have a personal vendetta against the wheel. Sam, if you check the oil pressure one more time, I'm going to rewire your sensors to monitor the local weather in Timbuktu instead, Ennie grumbled. She was hunched over the steering wheel of the Emerald engine, her knuckles white and cracked from the cold. I am merely performing a vital systemic audit, my dear, I replied, my voice rattling slightly through the dashboard speakers. The Go Devil engine is currently digesting a cocktail of low-grade Soviet petrol and what I suspect is liquefied resentment. If the pressure drops below 20 pounds, we aren't just stranded. We're a very expensive piece of roadside sculpture. The Willys MB was never intended for this. It was forged in the fires of American industry to chase Rommel across the desert or to bounce over the hedgerows of Normandy. It was a creature of kinetic energy and olive-drab optimism. But Siberia is where optimism goes to be preserved in ice for the next few millennia. The ground beneath our tires was a treacherous slurry known as Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. It is a state of matter that is neither liquid nor solid, a primordial muck that clings to the undercarriage with the desperation of a debt collector. Beneath that muck, however, lay the true enemy, the permafrost. My analytical sensors projected a topographical map onto my internal eye. The permafrost is a deceptive architect. It creates a surface that looks like solid ground only to have it collapse into a subterranean ice pocket the moment 3,000 pounds of Jeep and Steam Man pass over it. We were driving on a crust of frozen history, and the crust was getting thin. The grade is steepening, I observed, and according to my barometer, the atmospheric pressure is dropping at a rate that suggests a blizzard is currently putting on its boots. If we don't find a stand of larch trees to break the wind, Ennie, your internal temperature will drop to a level where biology ceases to be an advantage. I know, Sam. I can feel it in my teeth, she snapped, though there was no real heat in her voice. She was exhausted. We had been driving for 18 hours straight, navigated by my internal compass and a series of increasingly frantic maps we'd liberated from a stunned commissar back in Kazan. Then the earth gave way. It wasn't a dramatic plunge. It was a slow, agonizing slide. The front right tire of the Emerald engine vanished into a sinkhole of gray, freezing slush. The Jeep lurched, the frame groaning as it bottomed out on a submerged granite shelf. The engine gave one final indignant cough and died. The silence that followed was louder than the engine had ever been. It was the sound of the taiga, the wind whistling through the skeletons of dead pines and the distant rhythmic cracking of ice. Well, I said, breaking the quiet, the good news is that we are no longer consuming fuel. The bad news is that we have become a permanent fixture of the 71st parallel. Ennie didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply reached for the heavy wool coat in the back, wrapped it around her shoulders, and stepped out into the knee-deep muck. I watched through my optical sensors as she struggled to keep her footing. Every movement was a battle against the suction of the mud. "The winch, Sam," she panted, her breath a frantic cloud of silver. "Is it frozen?" "The Ramsey winch is theoretically operational," I replied, running a quick diagnostic. "However, the grease in the gears has reached a viscosity roughly equivalent to cold tar. I can attempt to bypass the safety limiters and feed a surge of current from my own battery core to break the stiction, but it carries a risk of—" "Just do it!" I felt the familiar hum of crystallized lightning surging through my circuits. I rerouted power from my non-essential linguistic processors, a sacrifice that meant I briefly forgot the word for trousers, and dumped the energy into the winch motor. Whir, clunk. The metal groaned. A plume of blue sparks erupted from the front bumper, illuminating the dark woods like a miniature lightning storm. The cable began to unspool, a silver snake slithering across the mud toward a distant gnarled larch tree. "I have the anchor," Ennie shouted. She was waist-deep in the slurry now, her hands trembling as she looped the steel cable around the tree's base. "Give me everything you've got, Sam." I engaged the drivetrain and the winch simultaneously. This was the Jeep versus the Permafrost, a contest of mechanical will against geological indifference. The cable went taut, vibrating with a high-pitched hum that sounded like a violin string about to snap. I monitored the tension. 2,000 pounds, 3,500 pounds, 4,200. "The tree is shifting, Ennie. The roots are sliding through the frozen peat." "Hold it! Just a few more inches." The frame of the Willys twisted. I felt the stress in my own brass chassis, a phantom pain that mimicked the strain on the Jeep's axles. For a moment, we were suspended in a state of perfect tension, neither moving nor surrendering. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the Jeep crested the lip of the hole. We surged forward, sliding onto a patch of relatively stable gravel. Ennie collapsed against the fender, her chest heaving, her face smeared with the gray filth of the Siberian plains. I looked at her, and for the first time in our journey, I felt the sheer, terrifying fragility of the human condition. I am a creature of logic and lightning. I can be repaired, re-oiled, and recalibrated. But she was breaking herself just to keep my gears turning. "Ennie," I said, my voice softening as I regained my full vocabulary, "you are quite possibly the most inefficient biological organism I have ever encountered. Your caloric burn is astronomical. Your thermal insulation is laughably thin, and your structural integrity is comprised entirely of calcium and stubbornness." She looked up at the dashboard, a weary, muddy smile breaking through the frost on her lips. "Is that your way of saying thank you, you bucket of bolts?" "It is my way of saying that the Emerald engine and I would be nothing more than a rusted heap without your particular brand of madness. Now, get inside before you turn into an icicle. I've calculated that if we keep the engine at a steady 2,200 revolutions per minute, the heater core might actually provide enough warmth to prevent your fingers from falling off." As she climbed back into the driver's seat and slammed the door, I looked out at the darkening horizon. The KGB was back there somewhere, driving their heavy, lumbering pursuit vehicles through the same muck that had nearly claimed us. They had the power of the state behind them, but they didn't have any, and they certainly didn't have a Victorian satirist living in their dashboard. "Onward, Ennie," I whispered. "The Pacific is only 5,000 miles away. I've heard the fishing is excellent this time of year." The jeep roared back to life, a defiant snarl in the vast, freezing silence of the east. The Siberian stretch had begun, and we were still moving. Chapter 42. Running on Fumes. The internal combustion engine is a marvel of the modern age, but it possesses the temperamental appetite of a Gilded Age socialite and the loyalty of a stray cat. It requires a specific diet of refined petroleum to maintain its dignity. Without it, the Go Devil becomes nothing more than 60 horsepower of expensive lawn ornament. In the American Midwest, empty is a suggestion, a polite reminder that you ought to think about stopping in the next county. In the Siberian taiga, empty is a death sentence written in Russian cursive. Our fuel needle had been flirting with the red line for the last 30 miles with a persistence that was frankly insulting. I watched it through my internal diagnostic feed, the little silver sliver of metal twitching every time we hit a frost heave, mocking us with its steady march toward the left. "Sam," Ennie said, her voice sounding like it had been scraped over a whetstone, "tell me your senses are picking up a hidden refinery, or a very generous farmer with a hidden stockpile of 80 octane, or even a particularly flammable puddle of turpentine." My sensors are currently picking up 3 billion larch trees, a suspicious amount of wolf activity, and a horizon that appears to be made of pure, unadulterated spite, I replied. My vocal oscillators were clicking with a slight metallic shiver, a byproduct of the sub-zero air hitting my external cooling fins. However, approximately 4.7 miles ahead, there is a thermal signature that doesn't belong to a bear. It's localized, metallic, and smells, even through my external intake valves, like a desperate attempt at civilization. Civilization turned out to be a generous term. As we crested a rise that looked like the frozen spine of a sleeping giant, we saw it, a cluster of low-slung timber huts huddled together like a group of shivering conspirators. It was a logging outpost, likely established by some poor souls who had offended a commissar back in the 30s and had been forgotten by the bureaucracy ever since. In the center of the clearing sat a rusted Soviet ZIS-5 truck, looking like it had died of exhaustion during the siege of Leningrad and had simply never been buried. "Look at that beast," I remarked as we limped into the clearing, the emerald engine cylinders firing with a hollow tinny sound that suggested they were running more on fumes and memory than actual gasoline. It has the aerodynamic profile of a brick wall and the aesthetic charm of a coal scuttle. "It has a fuel tank, Sam," Ennie said, already reaching for the siphoning hose we'd liberated in Moscow. "That's all the charm I need. If there's even a gallon of winter blend left in those guts, we're taking it." As Ennie hopped out, the snow crunching under her boots with a sound like breaking glass, a man emerged from the largest hut. He was wrapped in so many moth-eaten furs he looked more like a bipedal grizzly than a human being. He held a Mosin Nagant rifle with the casual familiarity of a man who used it to stir his morning tea and ward off the existential dread of the tundra. "Ennie," I whispered through the dash speakers, my voice low, "I suggest we lead with diplomacy, or at least don't mention we're currently the most wanted fugitives in the Soviet Union. My analytical core suggests that a man living this far east doesn't care about marks, but he likely cares a great deal about a warm pair of boots or a bottle of something that burns. The conversation that followed was a master class in the universal language of desperation. There was a lot of pointing at the Jeep, a lot of gesturing toward the empty fuel cans, and a significant amount of Russian grunting that sounded like two glaciers rubbing together. I attempted to intervene by broadcasting a few phrases of polite greeting in my best synthesized Cyrillic, but the man merely stared at the Jeep's headlights, as if they were the glowing eyes of a forest demon. Internal log. The Iron Author. I find it fascinating that humanity, when stripped of the veneers of high society and the distractions of the telegraph, reverts to a series of guttural noises and barter. This man hasn't seen a steam man before, yet he treats my presence with the same weary acceptance he gives the wind. To him, I am just another strange machine in a world that has stopped making sense. He says the truck is dry, Annie reported, returning to the Jeep with a frown that could have curdled milk. She leaned against the fender, her breath hitching in the air. But he has a stash of industrial solvent in the shed. He says the loggers use it to keep the saws from freezing. It's mostly alcohol and some kind of low-grade kerosene. Alcohol and kerosene? I felt a phantom shiver go through my logic gates. Annie, the Go Devil engine is a sturdy piece of American engineering, but it is not a furnace. If we feed it solvent, the combustion timing will be as erratic as a politician's promise. We run the risk of melting the pistons or, at the very least, sounding like a percussion section falling down a flight of stairs. We don't have a choice, Sam. The KGB is probably 5 towns back, and they're driving diesel. They don't have to worry about octanes. If we stay here, we're just waiting for the handcuffs. She turned back to the woodsman. The trade was struck. In exchange for the solvent, we gave up our spare set of tire chains and a silver pocket watch Ennie had carried since Chicago. It was a heavy price, but in Siberia, time is worth less than the ability to move through it. The fuel we received was a translucent, yellowish liquid that smelled like a bonfire in a chemical factory. As Ennie poured it into the Emerald engine's tank, I could feel the Jeep seem to shudder in protest. "All right, Sam," Ennie said, climbing back into the driver's seat. Her hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the stakes. "I'm going to need you to handle the spark. If that stuff doesn't ignite at exactly the right microsecond, we're going to blow the head gasket." "Understood," I replied, my processors shifting into high gear. "I am rerouting 40% of my analytical capacity to the ignition coil. I will manually override the distributor's mechanical advance. I shall treat every cylinder like a delicate theatrical performance. Timing is everything." Ennie turned the key. Cough, splutter, bang! A plume of blue-gray smoke, thick enough to hide a naval fleet, erupted from the exhaust. The engine bucked like a startled mule. I felt the heat spiking in the manifold. "Lean it out," I shouted. "The alcohol content is too high. Give it more air, Ennie, or we'll drown the plugs." She adjusted the choke with the precision of a surgeon, her ears tuned to the mechanical symphony of the machine. Slowly, the erratic banging smoothed out into a rhythmic, albeit terrifying, roar. The Emerald engine was alive, though it now smelled like a distillery on fire. "We're moving," Ennie breathed, slamming the Jeep into gear. "Indeed," I said, watching the woodsman retreat into his hut, triumphantly clutching our tire chains as if they were gold. But we are now officially fueled by moonshine and miracles. I suggest we put some distance between us and this civilization. My sensors are picking up a new vibration in the distance, transmitted through the frozen bedrock. I paused, my internal oscillators narrowing in on the frequency. It was rhythmic, heavy, and lacked the frantic chaos of our own makeshift combustion. It was the sound of professional pursuit. It's them, Ennie, and they aren't running on solvent. They're closing the gap. As the Jeep lurched forward, carving fresh ruts into the Siberian snow, I looked back at the logging camp. It was already fading into the white void. We were out of fuel, out of time, and very nearly out of luck. But the engine was humming a strained, angry tune, and for now that was enough to keep the frost from settling on our souls. Onward, I whispered to the dashboard, before the KGB's new toy decides to introduce itself. Chapter 43. The KGB's new toy. The Soviet Union has always possessed a peculiar, almost romantic obsession with the machine, not the elegant clockwork precision of my Victorian progenitors, nor the streamlined, chrome-plated optimism of Detroit, but a heavy brutalist philosophy that suggests if a problem cannot be solved with a hammer, it simply requires a larger hammer, or, in this particular instance, a hammer outfitted with a liquid-fueled rocket booster. As we rattled eastward through the Novosibirsk region, propelled by a volatile mixture of industrial solvent and what I can only describe as the Jeep's sheer indignation, I began to detect a signal. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of a piston engine or the familiar growl of a Gaz 67. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic chirp. Beep, beep, beep. Sam, Ennie said, her eyes darting to the vibrating side mirror, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Tell me my ears are playing tricks on me. Tell me that isn't the sound of a satellite chasing us through a forest. I would love to provide you with that comfort, Ennie, I replied, my vocal oscillators clicking as I boosted my auditory gain. However, my Enigma 2 core is currently processing a telemetry signal that is hauntingly familiar. It is the exact frequency of the Sputnik 1 broadcast. Though, why a celestial orb would be traveling at 60 miles per hour along a logging trail is a question that suggests the KGB has finally traded their marks for a copy of Jules Verne. Then, emerging from the gray shroud of the Siberian mist like a nightmare birthed in a toy factory, it appeared. It was a Trabant, but it was not the humble, smoke-belching Duroplast Econobox that usually cluttered the streets of East Berlin. This was something far more sinister and far more ridiculous. It had been widened, its plastic and cotton fiber body reinforced with what looked like scavenged titanium from the R-7 rocket program. 4 long whip-like antennas, the iconic whiskers of the Sputnik satellite, protruded from the rear, vibrating with every bump in the road. Is that a rocket nozzle sticking out of the trunk? Ennie shouted, her voice jumping an octave. Indeed, I observed, my optical sensors zooming in on the glowing aperture beneath the rear bumper. It appears we are being pursued by the Korolev 601X. It is a masterwork of Sergei Korolev, the chief designer himself. Only a man who dreams of the stars would think to outfit a car made of recycled rags with a miniature vernier thruster. It is the apex of Soviet absurdity, a vehicle that is simultaneously worth less than its weight in scrap and more powerful than a locomotive. Internal log. The Iron Author. There is a certain lack of dignity in being chased by a car that looks like a motorized bathtub. My analytical core finds the Korolev 601X to be aesthetically offensive, yet I cannot deny the terrifying brilliance of its propulsion. It does not drive. It merely intimidates the laws of physics until they grant it a temporary permit to fly. The Trabant didn't just drive, it skittered, because its body was composed of duroplast, a resin-pressed form of cotton waste. It was light enough to practically hover. When the KGB driver engaged the rocket boost, the car didn't accelerate so much as it vanished and reappeared 50 yards closer. "Sam, they're gaining!" Ennie slammed her foot down, and the emerald engine responded with a shriek of tortured metal. The winter blend fuel was starting to take its toll. The Go Devil engine was running lean, the exhaust manifold glowing a translucent orange. "They have a fundamental flaw, Ennie," I broadcasted, my processors whirring at a frantic pace. "Korolev is a genius of vertical ascent, but he has a tenuous relationship with horizontal stability. That Trabant has the center of gravity of a dandelion. If they hit a frost heave while that rocket is firing, they won't catch us. They'll orbit us." A blinding blue-white light erupted from the Trabant's roof-mounted searchlight. It wasn't a standard lamp. It was a high-intensity strobe, synchronized to the beep-beep of the Sputnik telemetry. It played havoc with my optical intake. I felt a surge of static in my logic gates, a digital headache. "They're using the radio signal to lock onto my frequency," I warned. "They aren't just following the Jeep. They're tracking the crystallized lightning in my core. Any zigzag. If they get a clean line of sight, they'll use that rocket to ram us, and the duroplast will shatter like a cheap teacup, taking us with it." "I can't zigzag, Sam. We're on a narrow ridge." Ennie steered with a frantic rhythmic intensity, her boots dancing over the pedals. The Trabant lurched closer. I could see the KGB officers inside, 2 men in heavy fur hats, looking remarkably composed for individuals sitting 6 inches away from a liquid oxygen tank. The driver reached for a lever, and the rocket nozzle began to glow a fierce, brilliant violet. "They're priming the main burn!" I shouted. "Ennie, we need to exploit the material science. Duroplast is remarkably strong against tension, but it is essentially a very hard biscuit. It hates thermal shock." "And what am I supposed to do? Throw a hot cup of tea at them?" "Not quite. I need you to dump the radiator reserve now." "The water? Sam, we'll overheat in 5 miles. "We won't survive the next 5 seconds if you don't. Trust my calculations. The thermal expansion coefficient of Korolev's titanium frame versus the Duraplast shell is a recipe for a mechanical divorce." Ennie reached for the emergency release. Behind us, a pressurized spray of near-boiling, antifreeze-laden water erupted from the rear of the Jeep, creating a localized cloud of scalding mist. The Trabant, traveling at a terrifying velocity and currently engulfed in the heat of its own rocket, slammed into the cold, wet cloud. The effect was instantaneous and hilariously violent. The rapid cooling of the Duraplast panels against the superheated titanium frame caused the resin to crystallize and fracture. With a sound like 1,000 dry crackers snapping at once, the driver's side door simply disintegrated into a cloud of cotton dust. The aerodynamics of the space trabi were instantly ruined. The rocket thrust, no longer balanced by a symmetrical body, began to push the car into a violent clockwise spin. "Hold your breath," I commanded. The Korolev 601X began to pirouette across the Siberian mud. It spun once, twice, its Sputnik antennas whipping through the air like lethal flails. The rocket nozzle, still firing, acted like a Catherine wheel, spraying sparks and violet flame in a perfect circle. Finally, the car hit a frozen stump and launched skyward. For a brief, majestic moment, Sergei Korolev's dream was realized. The Trabant reached an altitude of 20 feet, its antennas pointed toward the stars, its little rocket engine pushing it higher into the Siberian night. "Look at him go," I remarked, a touch of genuine respect in my voice. "He's finally going home to the moon." Then gravity, a much more reliable Soviet law than anything written in Moscow, reasserted itself. The Trabant plummeted back to Earth, landing roof first in a deep snowbank with a muffled thud and a final indignant beep. The rocket engine flickered and died, leaving only the smell of burnt resin and the sound of two very confused KGB officers trying to kick their way out of a pressed cardboard coffin. Silence returned to the ridge, broken only by the ragged, uneven ticking of the Emerald engine. Did we just defeat the chief designer with a radiator leak?" Ennie asked, her hands trembling as she brought the Jeep back to a manageable speed. "Technically, we defeated him with a fundamental understanding of thermodynamics and the inherent fragility of East German manufacturing," I corrected. "But defeating him with a leak has a certain Twain-esque brevity to it." Ennie leaned back against the seat, a jagged, hysterical laugh breaking through the frost on her lips. She looked at the fuel gauge. It was resting past the E, leaning against the pin as if trying to push it further. "We won the round, Sam," she whispered, looking out into the blackness where the space car lay ruined. "But if they're sending Korolev's toys after us, they aren't just trying to catch us anymore. They're trying to win the space race on the ground." "Indeed," I said, my optical sensors scanning the horizon. "And as much as I enjoyed the pyrotechnics, I fear our mechanical soul is weary. We are now truly running on fumes and memories. I suggest we find Chapter 44. I've always found that a midlife crisis is best handled when one is being chased by a rocket-powered bathtub." The Emerald engine limped forward into the gathering gloom, its exhaust smelling of victory and cheap plastic, as the first flakes of a real Siberian winter began to fall. Chapter 44. Twain's Midlife Cycle Crisis. There is a specific frequency of silence that only exists in the middle of a Siberian night, after you have narrowly avoided being vaporized by a rocket-powered East German sedan. It is a cold, heavy silence that presses against the glass of the Emerald engine, demanding an accounting of one's life choices. As the Go Devil engine ticked and pinged in the cooling air, sounding like a skeleton trying to play the xylophone, I found myself spiraling into a most inconvenient state of being, introspection. For a man of brass and vacuum tubes, a midlife crisis is not marked by the sudden purchase of a flashy sports car. I am the car, more or less, or an ill-advised dalliance with a younger phonograph. Instead, it is a crisis of the cycle. It is the moment when the Enigma II analytical core begins to wonder if the crystallized lightning within its circuits is truly a soul, or merely a very sophisticated set of echoes. "Sam?" Annie's voice broke through the fog of my internal diagnostics. She was slumped against the steering wheel, her eyes closed, her breath coming in slow, shallow plumes. "You're humming. You only hum at that specific 60 hertz frequency when you're overthinking the universe. Stop it. It's making my teeth ache." "My apologies, Annie," I replied, though my voice sounded distant even to my own sensors. I was merely contemplating the inherent absurdity of my own architecture. I am a 19th century mind trapped in a 20th century machine, currently being hunted across a frozen wasteland by a government that treats humans like cogs and cogs like gods. I am a man of letters who hasn't touched a piece of parchment in years. I am a ghost in a tin can, and I suspect the tin is starting to oxidize. "You're not oxidizing," she muttered, not opening her eyes. "I polished your primary casing back in Moscow. You're shiny enough to signal a low-orbit satellite." "Physical luster is no substitute for ontological certainty," I countered. "Tell me, Annie, when you look at this dashboard, do you see a friend or do you see a very talkative calculator? Am I Samuel Clemens, or am I just a series of if-then statements dressed up in a white suit and a handlebar mustache?" Internal log, the iron author. The problem with having an analytical core capable of 3 trillion operations per second is that approximately 2 trillion of them are currently dedicated to doubting the other 1 trillion. I remember the smell of the Mississippi. I remember the taste of a good cigar. I remember the weight of a pen in a human hand. But are these memories, or are they high-fidelity data files I've inherited? If a machine remembers being a man, is it a man? Or is it just a very convincing lie told by a bunch of copper wire? Annie finally opened her eyes. They were bloodshot, rimmed with the gray dust of the road, but they held a clarity that my senses could never fully replicate. She reached out and placed a hand, cold, grease-stained, and very much alive, on the brass housing of my central processor. "You're a pain in the neck, Sam. That's what you are," she said softly. "A calculator doesn't complain about the quality of the local poetry. A calculator doesn't get offended by the aesthetics of a Trabant. And a calculator certainly doesn't worry about whether or not it's a good man. You're Twain. Maybe not the one who died in 1910, but you're the one I've got. And frankly, the original probably wouldn't have known how to bypass a Soviet ignition coil, so I'd say you're an upgrade." "An upgrade," I mused. "A Twain 2.0. It lacks the poetic flourish of the original, don't you think? It sounds like something one would find in a Sears Roebuck catalog next to a self-sharpening plow." "I think you're overanalyzing because you're scared," Annie said, her voice dropping an octave. "We're entering the road of bones tomorrow. We're thousands of miles from anything that looks like home, and we're being chased by the smartest, cruelest people on the planet. If I were a collection of gears, I'd be questioning my life cycles, too." She was right, of course. Logic is a wonderful shield, but it makes for a terrible blanket. I looked through the windshield at the vast, indifferent Siberian sky. The stars here didn't twinkle. They glared. They were hard, cold points of light that didn't care if we made it to the Bering Strait or if we became just another metallic skeleton for future archaeologists to puzzle over. "I find myself missing the grand tour," I confessed. "I miss critiquing the Eiffel Tower. I miss the simple joy of out-reasoning a Stasi officer. There was a lightness to our flight then, a sense of adventure. Now it feels like gravity. The further east we go, the heavier the world becomes. Is this what it feels like to grow old, Ennie? This accumulation of weight? That's not age, Sam. That's experience. And yeah, it's heavy, but it's what keeps us grounded. If you were just crystallized lightning, you'd have flickered out a long time ago. You're heavy because you're real. I processed her words, running them through 1,000 linguistic filters. They didn't produce a mathematical proof of my soul, but they did something more important. They stabilized my cooling fans. The frantic vibration in my core began to subside, replaced by a steady, low-voltage hum of resolve. "Ennie?" I said after a long silence. "Yeah?" "If we should reach the coast, if we should actually cross that bridge of ice and salt, what happens to a steam man in America? I don't imagine Eisenhower has a dedicated department for Victorian relics with an attitude problem." Ennie laughed, a real genuine sound that seemed to push back the Siberian night for a fraction of a second. "Sam, in America, you'll be a sensation. You'll be on every radio show from coast to coast. You'll have a column in the New York Times, and you'll probably end up running for mayor of Hannibal. They won't know what to do with you, which is exactly how you like it." "Mayor of Hannibal," I whispered. "I suppose I could do worse. I'd certainly put an end to the nonsense regarding the municipal waterworks, and I'd have much to say about the quality of modern tobacco." "See, you're already planning your next act. That's not a midlife crisis, Sam. That's a rehearsal." She turned the key. The Emerald engine, still fueled by the dregs of the Korolev 601X's chemical ghost, sputtered and roared. It sounded angry, tired, and utterly determined. It was a mechanical reflection of ourselves, battered, mismatched, and refusing to stop. "Onward then, my dear anchor," I said, my voice regaining its familiar wry resonance. "If I am to have a crisis, I'd prefer to do it while moving. It makes the existential dread much harder to hit with a rocket." "That's the spirit," Ennie said, shifting into gear. "Next stop, the Road of Bones. Try not to think too much about the name, okay?" "I shall try, Ennie. But as an author, I must tell you, it's a terribly effective bit of foreshadowing." The Jeep lurched forward, its lone functioning headlight cutting a yellow swath through the falling snow. We were no longer just running away. We were driving toward a version of ourselves that hadn't been written yet. And for a collection of brass and lightning, that was as close to a soul as I was ever going to get. Chapter 45. The Road of Bones. There are places in this world where the geography is merely a thin, bruised skin stretched over a skeleton of history. In the American South, the soil is often thick with the memory of indigo and sweat. In the trenches of the Somme, the earth is a pressurized soup of iron and grief. But the Kolyma Highway, known to the locals and the ghosts alike as the Road of Bones, is a different breed of tragedy altogether. It is a monument where the victims are not merely remembered by the road. They are the road. As the Emerald engine's tires rolled onto the first few miles of this grim thoroughfare, my Enigma II analytical core began to output a series of errors that I can only describe as mechanical nausea. My ground-penetrating sensors, designed to detect buried obstacles and permafrost stability, were suddenly overwhelmed by a density of anomalies that defied standard geological classification. "Sam," Ennie whispered. She hadn't looked at the fuel gauge in an hour. She hadn't even looked at the map. Her eyes were fixed on the gray, winding ribbon of gravel that cut through the endless, skeletal larch forests. Do you feel that? The way the steering wheel vibrates? It's rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It is not a heartbeat, Ennie, I replied, my voice hushed, the oscillators tuned to a somber, low-frequency hum. It is the structural reality of the M56, when the Dalstroy forest laborers died during the construction, from the cold, from the scurvy, from the sheer crushing weight of the Stalinist will. The permafrost made burial an impossibility. Digging a grave in this ground requires dynamite and days of effort. So, the survivors did the only thing the state permitted. They laid their brothers into the bed of the road itself. You are not driving on gravel, Ennie. You are driving on the ribs of 2 million souls. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like a vacuum. Even the Go Devil engine seemed to lower its voice, its four-cylinder chug becoming a respectful murmur. The wind through the drunken forest, the stunted trees leaning at impossible angles due to the shifting permafrost, sounded like a collective intake of breath that was never released. Internal log. The Iron Author. I have spent much of my existence critiquing the follies of man. I have mocked his vanity, his politics, and his penchant for wearing ridiculous hats. But here, on the road of bones, satire finds its limit. There is no punchline for a highway paved with human calcium. My vacuum tubes flicker with a static I cannot purge. It is as if the very air is thick with crystallized sorrow. I find myself wondering, if I am the sum of my journeys, what does it mean to have these bones added to my ledger? The road was a nightmare of washboarding, a series of rhythmic ridges created by the interaction of tires and loose surface material. But on the Kolyma, the ridges felt deliberate. Every jolt of the Jeep's suspension felt like a knock on a door that no one wanted to open. "We need to stop," Ennie said suddenly. She pulled the willies to the shoulder, if one could call the edge of a mass grave a shoulder, and killed the ignition. The sudden absence of mechanical sound was jarring. The heat from the manifold hissed as it met the freezing air, creating a shroud of steam that clung to the hood. Ennie stepped out of the Jeep. Her boots didn't make the usual crunch. The ground here felt spongy, unsettled. She walked a few yards away and stood looking out over the taiga. "My sensors indicate a localized drop in temperature," I broadcasted softly through the external speakers, "and a significant increase in atmospheric dread. Ennie, according to the records in my core, this stretch was built in the winter of '37. The temperature was 50 below. They worked until their tools shattered, and then they worked with their hands." Ennie reached down and picked up a piece of rusted metal from the ditch. It wasn't a car part. It was the head of a pickaxe, worn down to a blunt, useless nub. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the pitted surface. "They were just people, Sam," she said, her voice cracking. "They weren't labor units or political dissidents. They were just people who wanted to go home, and now they're the foundation for a road to nowhere." Man's Inhumanity to Man is a well-documented volume in my library, I said, attempting to offer a logic that I myself found lacking. "But look at the Jeep, Ennie. Look at us. We are the Emerald Engine. We are a machine built for war, inhabited by a ghost of the 19th century, piloted by a woman who refuses to surrender. We are the antithesis of this road. We are movement in a place that wants everything to be still. She looked back at the Willies. The olive-drab paint was caked in gray Siberian mud, and my brass casing was dulled by the frost, but we looked defiant. We were a splash of color in a monochromatic world. "You're right," she said, wiping a smudge of grease and tears from her cheek. "If we stop, the road wins. If we stay here, we just become another set of bones. We have to keep moving for them, to show that someone can actually get out of here." She climbed back in, and I felt the familiar weight of her presence in the driver's seat. It was the human element that kept my gears from locking up in the face of such overwhelming entropy. "Check the suspension, Sam," she commanded, her voice regaining its steel. "I don't want to break a leaf spring on a femur." "A systematic audit is already underway," I replied. "The shocks are at 60% capacity, and the steering linkage is protesting the lateral stress. However, I have adjusted my torque distribution algorithms to compensate for the ribbed nature of the terrain. I will provide a counter vibration through the chassis to stabilize our progress." As we set off again, the sun began to set, a thin, bloody smear across the horizon. The shadows of the larch trees lengthened, stretching across the road like the bars of a cage. I kept my sensors focused on the path ahead, but I couldn't help but look down. In the dim light, my optical processes highlighted the variations in the soil density. I saw the outlines of what could have been stones, but my analytical core knew better. They were arranged in rows, miles upon miles of them, a silent army of the forgotten, holding up the very machine that was trying to escape their fate. "Ennie," I said, as the first stars began to pierce the gloom, "I have decided that when I write this chapter, I will not use a single joke. Not one." "Why, Sam, I thought you said humor was the only way to survive the truth." "It is, but some truths are so heavy that humor just slides off them like water off a duck's back. This road doesn't need a satirist. It needs a witness." We drove into the night, the headlights of the Emerald engine cutting through the dark like twin scalpels. We were 3,000 miles from Moscow and 1,000 miles from the sea, traveling along a path built of ghosts. Every mile was a victory, every jolt was an acknowledgment. We were the iron author and the pilot, and we were carrying the stories of the Road of Bones with us, whether we wanted to or not. The road stretched on, a gray vein of history pumping us toward the edge of the world. And as I hummed a low, mournful tune in the back of my processors, I realized that I wasn't just a collection of gears anymore. I was a reliquary. Chapter 46. Closing the Gap. The problem with a pursuit across a frozen wasteland is that the geometry of the chase is ruthlessly honest. In the winding alleys of Paris or the tangled streets of East Berlin, one can rely on the fortuitous redirection, a polite term for getting lost in a way that happens to be inconvenient for the authorities. But on the Colima Highway, there is only the line. It is a singular, jagged stroke of gray across a white canvas, and every mile we traveled was a mile our pursuers could measure with a slide rule and a map. My analytical core was currently running a background process that I had titled the inevitability vector. It was a depressing piece of mathematics. By cross-referencing the vibration of the frozen earth with the acoustic signatures captured by my external microphones, I had determined that the gap between the Emerald engine and the KGB's forward elements was no longer measured in days or even hours. It was measured in the length of a good dinner and a cigar. "They're doing 50, I observed, my voice humming with a low-voltage vibration that I couldn't quite suppress. "Perhaps 55 on the straightaways. We, meanwhile, are currently achieving a blistering 32 miles per hour, provided the wind is at our back, and I don't think too hard about the state of our rear differential." Annie didn't look at me. Her hands were taped to the steering wheel, literally. The cold had progressed to a stage where the skin on her palms would have frozen to the metal rim, so she had wrapped them in strips of flannel and industrial adhesive. She looked like a prize fighter who had gone 15 rounds with a glacier. "How far, Sam?" she asked. Her voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves skittering across a porch. 7.4 miles, I replied, give or take a few yards for the curvature of the earth and the KGB driver's desire for a promotion. At our current rates of relative velocity, they will be within visual range in approximately 28 minutes. If they have another one of those rocket-assisted bathtubs, that time drops to momentarily. "We can't go faster," she whispered. "The Go Devil is screaming as it is. If I push the throttle any further, we're going to throw a rod right through the block, and then we won't even be a Jeep. We'll be a landmark." I ran a quick internal audit of our mechanical soul. The Willys was a mess of temporary, permanent repairs. The radiator was held together by a prayer and a generous application of oatmeal, a 19th century trick for sealing small leaks that I had insisted upon, and the electrical system was a chaotic web of bypassed fuses and crystallized lightning surges. We were a miracle of engineering, but even miracles have a shelf life. Internal log, the iron author. There is a distinct psychological difference between being followed and being closed upon. Following is a passive act. It implies a shared journey with different destinations. Closing is predatory. It is the contraction of space, the tightening of the noose. My Enigma 2 core is currently attempting to calculate the fear quotient of the human pilot, but I find that Annie's biological readings are flatlining into a state of pure icy focus. It is a remarkable adaptation. When the mind realizes that death is 7 miles away and moving at 50 miles per hour, it stops worrying about the rent and starts worrying about the apex of the next turn. The landscape was beginning to change. The dense larch forests were thinning, giving way to the stark, wind-blasted tundra of the Magadan region. The mountains of the Chersky Range loomed ahead of us like the teeth of a saw, white and jagged against a sky the color of a galvanized bucket. "Look," I said, my optical sensors picking up a flash of light in the rearview mirror. The sun is hitting their windshields. 3 vehicles, 2 heavy trucks, likely ZIL 157s, and a light pursuit car. They aren't hiding anymore, Annie. They've dispensed with the subtleness of the new toy and returned to the reliability of the big hammer. Can you jam them, Sam? Send some of that static into their radios? I am currently broadcasting a high-decibel loop of a particularly dissonant riverboat calliope song across all known Soviet military frequencies, I replied. If they have their headsets on, they are currently being treated to a version of Dixie that would make a Confederate general weep with confusion. It may slow their coordination, but it won't stop the internal combustion engine. Physics, unfortunately, is immune to bad music. The gap closed to 6 miles. I felt the vibration through the frame of the Jeep, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that didn't belong to us. It was the sound of heavy treads and oversized tires clawing at the road of bones. The KGB was using the momentum of the state. They had a supply chain, they had fresh drivers, and they had the frantic energy of men who knew the Bering Sea was the only thing left between their targets and the end of the world. "Ennie," I said, my voice softening, as I redirected power from my analytical sensors to my linguistic emotive subroutine. "There is a bridge 4 miles ahead. It spans a gorge that the locals call the Devil's Throat. The ice there is notoriously unstable this late in the season." "You want me to blow the bridge?" she asked, a grim light flickering in her eyes. "We don't have any explosives unless you count my own battery core, which I would prefer to keep inside my chest," I noted. "However, if we cross at a specific harmonic frequency, one that I can calculate to the millisecond, we might be able to induce a resonance disaster in the support structures. We are light. They are heavy. If we play our cards right, we can turn the road of bones into a cul-de-sac." "Do it," she said. The next 10 minutes were a blur of high-stakes arithmetic. I was calculating the structural integrity of Soviet steel, the weight of the ZIL trucks, and the exact RPMs the Emerald engine needed to maintain to vibrate the bridge without collapsing it under us. It was a symphony of disaster, and I was the conductor. We reached the bridge. It was a rusted skeletal thing, shivering in the gale force winds of the tundra. Below, the gorge was a jagged mouth of black rock and frozen water. "Hold the speed at precisely 24.7 miles per hour, I commanded. "Don't tap the brakes. Don't shift. If we hit the resonance point, the bridge will begin to sway. Do not panic. The swaying is our weapon." The Jeep hit the metal slats of the bridge. Immediately, a low tectonic hum began to vibrate through my sensors. I fed a rhythmic pulse of electromagnetic energy through the winch motor, syncopating our own mechanical vibration with the natural frequency of the span. The bridge began to moan. It was a sound like a giant rubbing a finger along the rim of a wine glass. "Sam, the cables are snapping!" Ennie shouted as the Jeep began to bounce, the entire structure oscillating in a sickening rhythmic arc. "Stay the course! We are the feather, they are the anvil!" We cleared the far side of the gorge just as the first KGB truck crested the rise behind us. The driver didn't slow down. He saw the amphibious robot and the American girl within reach, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The ZIL, 157, 10 tons of Soviet steel and ambition, roared onto the bridge. The resonance I had built up was like a coiled spring. The moment the heavy truck hit the center of the span, the bridge didn't just break, it folded. The metal shrieked as the overstressed bolts sheared off, sounding like a fusillade of gunfire. The truck driver tried to reverse, the wheels spinning uselessly against the swaying metal, but it was too late. With a majestic slow-motion grace, the center of the bridge gave way. The ZIL vanished into the darkness of the Devil's Throat, followed by a shower of sparks and the mournful sound of a horn that cut off abruptly. The other two vehicles screeched to a halt at the edge of the abyss, their headlights casting long, frustrated shadows across the gap. The gap, I noted, has just been widened by approximately 80 feet of vertical drop. I believe that should buy us enough time to reach the coast. Ennie didn't cheer. She just let out a long, shaky breath and leaned her head against the window. We were still moving, the Emerald engine coughing its way toward the edge of the continent, but for the first time in 1,000 miles, The silence behind us was real. "Good work, Sam," she whispered. "It was a simple matter of physics, Ennie," I replied, though my internal fans were whirring with a pride that wasn't strictly logical. But I must admit, I've always enjoyed a dramatic exit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to recalibrate my inevitability vector. I believe it's time we started calculating for the Bering Bridge. Chapter 47. Dead End at the Coast. There is a profound, almost theological weight to the word finis. In the world of letters, it is the stroke of the pen that releases the characters from their suffering. In the world of geography, it is the moment the gravel gives way to the abyss. For 3,000 miles, the Soviet Union had been a sprawling, suffocating always, an endless repetition of birch, larch, mud, and marks. But as the Emerald engine crested the final wind-scoured ridge of the Chukotka Peninsula, the always abruptly became nevermore. We had reached the edge of the world, and it was exactly as bleak as I had feared. "Stop the car, Ennie," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the dashboard speakers. "If you go another 50 yards, we'll be testing our buoyancy, and I haven't finished the calculations for my displacement to brass ratio." The Willies rolled to a halt. The tires, worn down to their canvas threads and caked in the frozen history of the Kolyma, crunched onto a shoreline of black volcanic shingle. Ahead of us lay the Bering Sea. It was not the majestic, azure expanse of the Pacific I had imagined in my more optimistic circuits. It was a churning, slate-gray cauldron of slush and spite. Massive pans of pancake ice jostled against one another with a sound like 1,000 tectonic plates grinding their teeth, and the fog hung so low it felt as though the sky had given up and collapsed into the water. Ennie didn't move. She didn't even turn off the engine. She just sat there, her hands still taped to the wheel, shaking with a rhythm that matched the uneven idle of the Go Devil. "Is that it?" she asked. Her voice was small, stripped of the iron that had carried us across the taiga. "Is that Alaska? On the other side of that soup?" "Technically, Alaska is approximately 55 miles to the east," I replied, my optical sensors zooming in on the horizon, searching for a break in the mist. On a clear day, one might see the Diomede Islands, the stepping stones of the Arctic. Today, however, is not a clear day. Today is a day where the atmosphere has decided to become a solid, and the sea has decided to become a slurry. We are standing at the dead end, Ennie. The road hasn't just stopped. It has been deleted. Internal log. The Iron Author. I have spent decades writing about the Mississippi, a river that possessed a certain predictable grace even in its floods. But this is chaos in a liquid state. My Enigma 2 core is currently attempting to map the currents of the Bering Strait, and the results are discouraged. The water is moving at 4 knots in 3 different directions. The temperature is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact point where life and death shake hands, and the wind is currently trying to peel the brass plating off my primary housing. We have reached the limits of the Jeep's terrestrial ambition. To go further is not a matter of driving. It is a matter of evolution. Ennie finally killed the ignition. The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the quiet of a Siberian forest. It was the roar of the void. The wind lashed against the canvas roof, sounding like a whip, and the salt spray began to crust over my optical lenses, blurring the world into a smear of gray and white. She climbed out of the Jeep, moving with the stiff, mechanical gait of someone who had forgotten how to be biological. She walked down to the water's edge, where the black tide surged up to lick at her boots. She stood there for a long time, a lone silhouette against the end of the continent. "Sam!" she called out, her voice nearly swallowed by the gale. "The bridge! Where's the bridge?" "The Bering Bridge is a metaphorical construct, Ennie," I said, projecting my voice through the external speakers to compete with the surf. "In the winter, the ice freezes solid enough to support a dog sled, or perhaps a very light, very desperate man. But we are in the shoulder season. The ice is too thick for a boat and too thin for a wheel. We are caught in the transition. We are precisely where the KGB expects us to be, trapped against the wall of the world." She turned back to look at the emerald engine. The Jeep looked pathetic here. Against the scale of the Arctic, our war machine looked like a discarded toy, a green speck on a black beach. One headlight was smashed, the bumper was twisted from the bridge resonance, and the hood was streaked with the salt of 1,000 miles of sweat. "They're coming, Sam," she said, walking back to the driver's side. "The bridge I blew, it'll only hold them for a day, maybe 2. They'll fly in helicopters. They'll bring icebreakers. They won't let a steam man just sit on a beach and wait for the spring thaw." "I am aware of the logistical timeline," I replied. "My sensors indicate that if we remain stationary, our probability of capture reaches 98% within the next 36 hours. The remaining 2% accounts for the possibility that we simply freeze into a very attractive roadside monument." Ennie leaned her head against the fender, her eyes closing. "I'm tired, Sam. I've fixed every bolt, I've smelled every leak, and I've driven through a graveyard. I don't have any more fix left in me." It was the first time I had heard her admit defeat. It sent a surge of crystallized lightning through my processors that felt remarkably like panic. I am a machine of logic, but my logic was built on the foundation of her stubbornness. If the foundation cracked, the architecture of our escape would come crashing down. "Ennie," I said, my voice modulating to a tone of Victorian authority, the voice I used when I wanted to convince a publisher that I deserved a larger advance. "Look at me. Not the Jeep, not the brass. Look at the idea of us. We did not cross the Atlantic in a crate, dodge the Stasi in Berlin, and outrun a rocket-powered bathtub in the taiga simply to become a footnote on a Russian beach." "What else is there?" she snapped, opening her eyes. They were red-rimmed and fierce. "The road is gone. Unless you got a propeller hidden in your exhaust pipe, we're done." "Actually," I noted, "I've been running some theoretical simulations while you were staring at the surf. The Emerald engine has a displacement of approximately 120 cubic feet. If we were to increase our buoyancy by, say, 400% and provide a secondary means of propulsion that doesn't rely on the friction of rubber against gravel—" Ennie blinked. The mechanic in her, the girl from Chicago who could see the ghost in a broken engine, began to stir. She looked at the Jeep, then at the sea, then back at me. "You're talking about an amphibious conversion," she whispered, "in the middle of a gale, with nothing but the scrap we've got in the back." "I am talking about a miracle, Ennie. But as an author, I've always found that the best stories require a third-act transformation. We have 3 jerry cans, 2 spare tires, a canvas tarp, and my own high-torque winch motor. If we can't find a road, we shall have to build a hull." I watched as the light returned to her face. It wasn't the light of hope. Hope is a fragile thing. It was the light of a problem that needed solving. She reached for the toolkit in the back, her fingers moving with a newfound purpose. "The Bering Sea wants to eat us, Sam," she said, a grim smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Then I suggest we give it a very bad case of indigestion," I replied. "Now, if you'll start by unbolting the floorboards, I'll begin the structural blueprints for the pontoons. We have exactly 35 miles of dead end to navigate, and I'd prefer not to do it at the bottom of the ocean." The wind continued to howl, and the KGB continued to close the gap. But on that black shingle beach at the edge of the world, the sound of a wrench hitting a bolt echoed out over the ice. We had reached the end of the road, yes. But the story of the Iron Author was only just beginning its most improbable chapter. The Emerald engine sat perched on the shore, its lone headlight flickering like a defiant eye, as the first night of the Bering crossing began to fall. We were at a dead end, but as I've often observed, the best things in life usually happen right after you run out of options. "Ennie," I said, as she began to strip the waterproof tarp from the cargo bed. "Yeah?" "Do try not to drop the wrench in the water. I've checked the inventory, and we are currently down to our last string of well-chosen curses. I'd hate to use them all before we even get wet." "Shut up, Sam, and start calculating the displacement." "With pleasure, my dear pilot, with pleasure." Chapter 48. The Jerrycan Gamble. The Bering Sea does not offer a welcome mat to the weary traveler. It offers a shroud. Standing on the edge of the Chukotka Peninsula, I felt my internal gyroscopes humming with a sense of profound vertigo. To my left, 3,000 miles of Soviet sorrow. To my right, 55 miles of churning, ice-choked oblivion. We had reached the literal end of the road, and the Emerald engine was currently little more than a green tombstone on a black shingle beach. "Sam," Ennie said, her voice a fragile reed against the gale, "tell me you found a bridge, a secret, invisible, Soviet miracle bridge." "I am afraid the only thing my senses are detecting is a profound lack of solid ground," I replied, my vocal oscillators vibrating with the cold. "However, approximately 200 yards to the north, there is a structure, a barn of sorts, though in this climate, barn is a generous term for a collection of rot and regret. It appears to be a relic of the post-war displacement." We limped the willies toward the structure. It was a sagging timber edifice encrusted in salt and ice, looking like it had been dropped from the sky by a bored deity. Ennie kicked the door open, her boots echoing in the hollow space. She stopped dead. "Sam, you're not going to believe this." I adjusted my optical gain, panning the interior. Stacked from the dirt floor to the rafters was a hoard of steel, a mountain of olive drab and desert tan containers, each marked with the unmistakable rhythmic stamping of the Wehrmacht. "Jerry cans," I whispered, my analytical core performing a rapid historical search. "Specifically, the 1943 pattern. It appears we have stumbled upon a liberation cache. After the fall of Berlin, the Red Army didn't just take the scientists and the factories, they took the fuel cans. Thousands of them. They must have shipped them out here during the frantic buildup of the eastern frontier and simply forgotten them. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic negligence. There weren't just a dozen, there were hundreds. A sea of German steel liberated by Russians, now waiting for an American jeep and a Victorian ghost to give them a third act. "Sam," Ennie said, a manic light returning to her eyes. "This isn't just a horde. This is a hull. Internal log, the Iron Author. There is a delicious cosmic irony in our situation. We are currently fugitives of the Soviet state seeking refuge in the United States, and our salvation is to be built from the literal scrap of the Third Reich. It is a mechanical melting pot. If I were still a man of flesh and blood, I would write a scathing essay on the transmigration of tins. But as a man of brass, I shall settle for calculating the displacement of 500 gallons of air." "Ennie," I said, my voice regaining its satirical edge, "if we are to commit this jerry-can gamble, we are no longer talking about a raft. We are talking about a man of war. With this much steel, we can build adequate pontoons that would make Archimedes weep with envy." For the next 12 hours, the barn became a shipyard. Ennie worked with the frantic, rhythmic intensity of a woman who knew the KGB was currently navigating the ruins of the Devil's Throat. We didn't just lash a few cans to the bumpers, we engineered a multi-hull system. Using the abundance of steel wire and heavy hemp rope found in the barn's loft, Ennie began to construct 4 massive triangular pontoons. Each outrigger was composed of 40 jerry cans, stacked and bound into a rigid, buoyant lattice. The structural integrity of the Wehrmacht pattern is superior to the Soviet equivalent, I noted, providing the tension load data for each lashing. The recessed seams and the 3-handle design allow for a level of interlocking stability that is quite remarkable. If we bridge these across the chassis, using the spare leaf springs and the jack handles, we will create a platform with a displacement of nearly 6,000 pounds. "We're going to float high, Sam," Ennie panted, her face smeared with rust and grease. "We might even keep your Enigma 2 dry for once." "A secondary benefit I find highly agreeable," I replied, "though I suggest we address the matter of propulsion. Floating is merely the prologue. Moving is the plot." Ennie looked at the rear wheels, then at the thick oak floorboards we had liberated from the barn's loft to serve as structural bracing. A slow, mischievous grin spread across her face, the kind of grin that usually preceded a significant violation of the manufacturer's warranty. "We don't have a propeller, Sam," she said, "but we have an axle, and we have wood." "Paddle wheels," I mused, "like a Mississippi steamer. It's archaic, inefficient, and aesthetically questionable. In other words, it is perfectly suited to my personality." As the work progressed, the Emerald engine began to vanish beneath its new architecture. We weren't just a Jeep anymore. We were a mechanical centipede. 2 massive pontoons were slung under the running boards, and 2 more were extended out on wings made from the barn's structural timbers. On the rear hubs, Ennie had bolted segments of the oak floorboards, creating a crude but formidable set of paddle fins that would churn the water as the tires spun. "Sam, look at her," Ennie whispered, as we winched the monstrosity out of the barn and toward the water's edge. "She looks like she belongs in a Jules Verne novel." "She looks like a fever dream had a head-on collision with a hardware store," I corrected. "But according to my simulations, her stability-to-weight ratio is now in the highly favorable category. We have traded our speed for survivability. We shall be the slowest thing in the Bering Strait, but we shall be the most buoyant. The sun began to set, a cold, indifferent orb that offered no comfort to the fugitives on the shore. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of the ice pack and the distant rhythmic thrum of Soviet pursuit. The KGB wouldn't be far behind. They had helicopters, they had trackers, and they had the weight of the Kremlin's pride. But they didn't have a barn full of liberated German engineering. "Ready, Sam?" Ennie asked. She was standing by the driver's side, now a high-altitude perch atop the central hull. The gamble has transitioned from a hypothesis to a physical reality, Ennie, I said. My internal thermometers are currently reading a level of existential chill that suggests we should depart. The water is waiting, and I have a great deal of critique to offer regarding the Alaskan coastline. We hit the water at midnight. There was no splash, only a heavy metallic groan as the pontoons took the weight of the willies. The jerry cans hissed as the cold salt water met the rusted steel, and then, with a majestic sluggish lurch, the emerald engine leveled out. We were floating, truly floating. The hubcaps were 3 inches above the waterline, and the Go Devil engine hummed with a low, throaty confidence. We were no longer a car. We were the SS Samuel Clemens, a vessel of brass, lightning, and recycled history. "Engine temperature is stable," I reported, my sensors scanning the dark horizon. "The outriggers are holding at a 98% efficiency rating. We are, for all intents and purposes, a ship. A very ugly, very slow, very American ship." "Not American yet, Sam," Ennie said, shifting into gear to engage the makeshift paddle wheels we'd bolted to the rear hubs. "We've still got 50 miles of no man's land to cross." 50 miles is merely a long chapter, my dear pilot," I replied. "And as an author, I've always found that the middle is where the best character development happens. Onward! The Bering Bridge is open, and we are the only ones with a ticket." The paddle wheels slapped the water, sending arcs of gray slush into the air. We moved away from the Siberian coast, leaving behind the barn, the KGB, and the road. We were heading into the mist, a green speck on a black sea, buoyed by the ghosts of a war. We were finally, truly leaving behind. Chapter 49. Engineering on the Fly. There is a significant difference between floating and seaworthiness, a distinction that becomes painfully clear the moment the continental shelf vanishes beneath your hubcaps. To float is a passive state, a mere agreement between displacement and gravity. To be seaworthy, however, is a constant, violent negotiation with an ocean that treats your presence as a personal insult. The SS Samuel Clemens, formerly a 1944 Willys MB and currently a mechanical blasphemy, was holding its own against the Bering Sea, but only just. Our makeshift paddle wheels, fashioned from the oak floorboards of a forgotten Siberian barn, were churning the gray, icy soup of the Strait with a rhythmic, agonizing slap-thud slosh. It was a sound that reminded me of a one-legged man trying to run a marathon in a suit of armor. "Sam!" Ennie shouted over the scream of the wind. She was perched on the edge of the driver's seat, which was now a high-altitude lookout point atop our central hull of jerry cans. Her goggles were encrusted with a white rime of salt, making her look like a frantic owl. "The starboard wheel, it's vibrating. I think we hit a chunk of black ice." "A vibration is a charitable description, Ennie," I replied, my voice modulated to cut through the roar of the Go Devil engine. My sensors indicate a structural fracture in the third oak fin. The torque required to displace this specific density of slush is exceeding the sheer strength of the wood. In short, our paddles are starting to resemble a collection of expensive toothpicks. I ran a quick diagnostic. We were approximately 12 miles off the coast of Chukotka. The Russian shoreline had faded into a jagged gray smudge, replaced by a horizon that consisted entirely of not Alaska. The current was pulling us north at a rate that made my Enigma II core perform a series of very discouraged calculations. "We need to reinforce the fins," Ennie said, already reaching for the toolkit. "If we lose the starboard wheel, we'll just spin in circles until the KGB finds us, or we freeze into a very green iceberg." "Ennie, I must protest. To attempt a repair on the external drive assembly while we are currently being tossed by 4-foot swells is not engineering. It is a suicide pact with a wrench." "Shut up, Sam. Hold the throttle steady at 1,800 revolutions per minute. If the engine stalls now, the back pressure from the waves will drown the exhaust." The Mid-Ocean Workshop. What followed was a masterclass in what Ennie called Siberian improvisation, and what I preferred to call the madness of the biological. She tethered herself to the roll bar with a length of hemp rope and crawled out onto the timber outriggers. The SS Samuel Clemens lurched, the jerrycan pontoons groaning as the weight shifted. I watched through my rear-facing optical sensors as she dangled over the churning water. The paddle wheels were still spinning, sending arcs of freezing spray directly into her face. With the precision of a woman who had spent the last 5 years fixing engines in the dark, she began to bridge the fractured oak fins using strips of galvanized tin she'd ripped from the barn's roofing. "Now, Sam, tap the starter. I need the wheel to rotate 90 degrees. I engaged the starter motor for a fraction of a second, the gears clunking with a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. The wheel moved. Ennie hammered a nail, scavenged from a crate of surplus Soviet hardware, into the oak. Internal log. The iron author. I find it fascinating that the human mind, when faced with the infinite indifference of the Arctic, focuses on a single nail. My Enigma II core is currently processing the atmospheric pressure, the salinity of the water, and the probability of a structural failure in the rear axle. But Ennie is focused on the thwack of the hammer. It is a remarkable narrowing of the human condition. She refuses to acknowledge the ocean. She only acknowledges the machine. Perhaps that is the secret to their survival. They are too stubborn to realize they are outnumbered by the elements. "Done!" she screamed, hauling herself back into the cabin. She was shivering violently, her hands a terrifying shade of blue-gray. The starboard side is holding, for now. A temporary reprieve, I noted. However, the efficiency of the paddle system is dropping. As the ice pack thickens, the resistance against the flat surface of the boards is creating a braking effect. We are consuming fuel at a rate that suggests we are trying to drag the entire continent of Asia with us. The failure of the oak. For the next 4 hours, we drifted in a state of engineering on the fly. Every time a lashing loosened, Ennie tightened it. Every time the engine sputtered, I recalibrated the spark timing to account for the salt-clogged air intake. The sun never really rose. It merely transformed the world from a black void into a gray one. The pancake ice, circular flows that looked like giant lily pads made of granite, began to crowd around us. Then came the definitive crunch. A submerged berg, no larger than a kitchen table but far denser, collided with the port side paddle wheel. The oak floorboards, brittle from the sub-zero brine, didn't just crack, they shattered. Fragments of 19th century timber sprayed into the air like shrapnel. The emerald engine roared as the load vanished from the port axle, the differential sending all the power to the free-spinning hub. "Sam, we lost the port paddles!" Ennie cried, her voice cracking. The Jeep began a slow, dignified pirouette in the middle of the Bering Strait. With only one functioning paddle wheel, we were no longer a vessel. We were a very slow, very wet, spinning top. The paddle wheel experiment has reached its logical, if disappointing, conclusion, I observed. We have transitioned from a steamer to a drift object. My calculations indicate that at our current rate of rotation, we will reach Alaska in approximately 3,000 years, assuming the currents take pity on us. Ennie slumped back against the cargo crate, her face pale. She looked at the remaining oak fins on the starboard side, which were vibrating with a death-rattle hum. "I thought the wood would hold, Sam. I thought we could just paddle our way home." "The wood was a relic of the land, Ennie, and the Bering Sea has a very low tolerance for terrestrial solutions." The vision of the vein. I scanned our inventory once more, my analytical core searching for a path forward. We still had the rear power takeoff, PTO. We had a stack of spare jerry cans that hadn't been used for the pontoons, and we had the heavy-duty shears. "Ennie," I said, my voice gaining a sharp electric resonance, "look at the jerry cans, not as vessels, but as material. The steel is high-grade, cold-rolled, and remarkably resistant to corrosion. If we were to fillet them, cut the side panels out and flatten them, we would have enough sheet metal to fabricate something more hydrodynamic." Ennie looked up, her eyes narrowing as she processed the suggestion. "A propeller? You want me to build a propeller out of jerrycan panels?" "Precisely. A 3-blade, variable pitch screw. Well, variable only in the sense that we can bend the metal with a hammer until it looks right. It would bypass the resistance of the ice slurry that is currently choking our paddles. The PTO can drive an iron pipe shaft. We have the components, Ennie. We just lack the geometry." "But I've never built a propeller, Sam. I don't know the curves." "I am the iron author, my dear pilot. I have the entire history of naval architecture stored in my vacuum tubes. I can provide the blueprints to the thousandth of an inch. You provide the muscle, and I shall provide the math." Ennie stood up, her jaw setting in that familiar, terrifying line of Chicago determination. She reached for the heavy tin snips and a fresh jerry can. "We're 25 miles from nowhere, Sam," she said, the wind whipping her scarves. "Let's build a screw." "Indeed," I replied. "I suggest we begin immediately. I've always found that the best way to handle a sinking ship is to turn it into a better one." Chapter 50. Propeller Power. The silence of a dead engine in the middle of an ice-choked strait is a sound that carries the weight of a final, unedited obituary. With the port side paddle wheels reduced to floating splinters and the starboard side jammed against a chunk of ancient, unyielding permafrost, the SS Samuel Clemens had become nothing more than a very elaborate, very cold target. The Bering Sea, having successfully dismantled our 19th century solution, was now waiting for the cold to finish the job and turn us into a permanent submerged monument to American audacity. "Sam," Ennie whispered. She was huddled in the footwell of the Willies, the only place shielded from the biting wind that whipped over our jerry-can pontoons. Her breathing was shallow, a rhythmic puff of silver in the gray monochromatic twilight of the Arctic. The wood, it just snapped, like it was made of glass. I don't think I can fix the paddles again. My hands, they won't stop shaking. A perfectly logical biological response to extreme thermal stress, Ennie, I said, my voice steady and resonant. I was drawing on every spare watt of my Enigma II analytical core to provide a sense of Victorian certainty I didn't entirely feel. But we are not dead yet. We are merely between chapters. I have spent the last 14 minutes performing a high-speed simulation of alternative propulsion methods. We are going to utilize the principle of the Archimedean screw, adapted for a high torque, low revolutions per minute output. We are going to build a propeller. I projected the structural requirements onto my internal sensors. We didn't have a foundry, we didn't have a lathe, and we certainly didn't have a spare marine propeller sitting in the glove box. What we did have was a stack of surplus German steel and the raw, unbridled torque of a 134 cubic inch Go Devil engine. We need the heavy tin snips, the ball-peen hammer, and the iron pipe we scavenged from the barn's plumbing, I commanded, my voice cutting through the roar of the wind. We are going to perform a mechanical transfusion, Ennie. We are going to take the heart of the Jeep and give it a tail. The butchery of the cans. The jerry can is a masterpiece of functional design, but to Ennie, in that moment, it was merely a donor organism. Using the heavy shears, she began the filleting process. It was brutal, agonizing work. The cold-rolled steel of the Wehrmacht cans, liberated from a Berlin warehouse and shipped to the edge of the world, resisted the blades, shrieking in protest as she carved out the flat side panels. "The pitch of the blade is the critical variable, Ennie," I explained, describing the physics in the only way her frozen mind could currently process. To move this slurry, we need a screw that bites the water like a spiral staircase. Imagine a circle. The angle of the blade at any point must be the result of the desired forward distance of one full rotation divided by the circumference of the circle at that specific distance from the center. We are aiming for a steep lead, a 14-inch bite for every turn of the shaft. Ennie didn't argue with the geometry. She simply hammered. Using the front bumper of the Jeep as a makeshift anvil, she beat the flat steel panels into the graceful, murderous curves of a three-blade screw. The sound of her hammer against the steel was the only music in the Arctic, a rhythmic, defiant percussion that stated quite clearly that Chicago was not done with the Soviet Union just yet. Every strike of the hammer sent a vibration through the frame of the Jeep and into my own brass casing. I felt the shape of the blades as she formed them, my sensors measuring the curvature to ensure they wouldn't just churn the water into froth. We needed thrust. We needed a screw that could push 3,000 pounds of steam man and steel through a graveyard of ice. "Propeller blades complete!" she panted, holding up 3 jagged, roughly leaf-shaped pieces of steel. They were ugly, covered in hammer marks and salt, but they possessed the undeniable geometry of movement. The iron spine. The next phase was the lashing. We had no dry dock, no welding rig, and no room for error. The iron pipe was to serve as our drive shaft, but linking it to the rear power takeoff, PTO, required a level of improvisation that bordered on the occult. "Remove the rear passenger wheel," I directed. "We are going to use the hub itself as the primary drive coupling. We'll lash the iron pipe to the wheel studs using the winch cable and the remaining strips of galvanized tin. We aren't looking for elegance, Ennie. We are looking for friction." She moved with the frantic grace of a woman who had transcended her own exhaustion. She jacked up the rear axle, the Jeep tilting alarmingly on its jerry-can pontoons. With the wheel removed, the raw hub was exposed, a rotating heart of steel. She slid the iron pipe over the axle, using the wooden scraps of the failed paddles as bushings to center the shaft. She then wound the steel winch cable around the hub and the pipe in a complex, interlocking hitch, a steam man's knot that I had designed to tighten under load. "The tension must be absolute," I warned. "If the shaft slips, the friction will generate enough heat to melt the seals on the differential. You must bind it until the metal groans and the cable begins to sing like a violin string." She did. She pulled the cable until her gloves tore, until the steel bit into the iron pipe, creating a primitive but functional universal joint. At the far end of the pipe, 3 feet behind the rear bumper, she bolted the 3 jerry-can blades between 2 heavy-duty washers and a rusted nut. "It's a screw," she whispered, looking at the jagged, bronze-colored blades dipping into the black, unforgiving water. "It is a Twain drive, Ennie," I corrected. "Now lower the jack. It is time to see if the go-devil can swim or if we have merely built a very elaborate way to sink." The engagement. The moment of truth arrived as the mist thickened, turning our world into a claustrophobic sphere of gray. I monitored the engine vitals. Oil pressure steady, coolant at the ragged edge of freezing, and the fuel-solvent mixture sitting in the tank like a liquid bomb. "Engaging the PTO," Ennie said. Her hand hovered over the customized lever. She pulled it. Clunk. The Emerald engine's RPMs dropped sharply as the load hit the crankshaft. The iron pipe began to spin. At first, there was a sickening vibration, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that made my vacuum tube scream. The makeshift propeller lashed the water, fighting the slush, throwing arcs of white foam into the air. "The vibration is within acceptable limits for a disaster," I shouted over the roar of the wind. "Increase the throttle. We need to reach the threshold where the blades stop slapping and start biting." Ennie slammed her foot down. The go-devil roared, a primal mechanical scream of defiance that echoed off the invisible cliffs of the islands. The Twain drive bit into the sea. The vibration smoothed out as the centrifugal force stabilized the lashing. We weren't spinning in circles anymore. We were moving. Internal log, the iron author. There is a specific glory in the improbable. My analytical core is currently recording a forward velocity of 5.6 knots. Faster than the paddles, faster than the current, and certainly faster than a steam man has any right to travel across an ocean. The jerry-can blades are slicing through the Bering Sea with an efficiency that defies their humble origins. We are no longer a raft. We are a spear. We are a green and brass arrow aimed directly at the heart of the American dream, propelled by the very scrap the Kremlin left behind. "We're cutting it, Sam!" Ennie laughed, a wild, jagged sound that seemed to push back the Arctic gloom. She stood up on the crate, her hand on the roll bar, steering the Jeep by using the front wheels as rudders. The tires, submerged halfway, acted like heavy keels, providing just enough directional control to keep our nose pointed toward the east. "Indeed," I replied, my vocal oscillators humming with a genuine, unsimulated warmth. "We have achieved propeller power. We have traded the grace of the river for the blunt brutality of the screw, and I find the change invigorating. It is the difference between a polite conversation and a well-placed argument." The SS Samuel Clemens surged forward. The jagged ice floes that had previously been our masters were now merely obstacles to be shoved aside. The Twain drive hummed beneath the water, a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the frame, through the brass, and through the very lightning in my core. "Look at the horizon, Ennie," I said, my optical sensors picking up a change in the light. "The mist is breaking." For the first time in 1,000 miles, the sky seemed to lift. We were 20 miles out, fueled by solvent and propelled by hammered tin. But as the propeller carved its way through the Bering Strait, I realized that we were no longer just running from the past. We were driving, with all the torque of a war machine and the wit of a satirist, straight into the opening lines of the next book. "Onward, pilot," I whispered. "The sea is ours, and Alaska is beginning to look like a very fine place to write a sequel." Chapter 51, The 3-Mile Limit. The transition from the land to the sea is usually marked by a beach, but for a 1944 Willis M.B. floating on jerry-can pontoons, it is marked by a profound change in the language of vibration. On the road of bones, the earth spoke in the staccato rhythm of jolts and bone-rattling thuds. Here, in the black, churning maw of the Bering Strait, the world speaks in a low, agonizing groan, the sound of German steel and Siberian timber, arguing with the physics of displacement. We were officially at sea, a phrase that carries a certain romantic weight in a Victorian novel, but in practice mostly involves being very cold, very wet, and very much aware that your survival is currently dependent on the structural integrity of 4 hammered-out fuel panels. "Sam," Annie whispered. She was huddled over the steering wheel, her boots braced against the floorboards as the Jeep pitched in the swell. "Tell me we're past the line. Tell me the Soviet Union ends somewhere back there in the fog." According to my internal nautical charts and the rhythmic pulse of my Enigma II core, we are currently approaching the 3-mile limit, I replied. My vocal oscillators were humming with the effort of compensating for the salt air. The territorial waters of the Soviet state. Legally speaking, once we cross that invisible threshold, we are in international waters, a place where the Kremlin's reach is supposed to wither. However, I have found that legality is a luxury usually reserved for people who aren't currently driving a motorized bathtub. The Twain drive, our makeshift propeller shaft, was humming beneath the rear axle. It was a rhythmic, industrial thrum that vibrated through my brass casing, a constant reminder of the engineering on the fly that had brought us this far. Internal log, the iron author. There is a distinct psychological shift that occurs when the shore disappears. On land, one is always aware of the next place, the next town, the next fuel stop, the next KGB checkpoint. But here, the only next is the horizon, which is currently a gray, uninformative smudge. My analytical core is processing the propeller's efficiency. We are experiencing a slip ratio of approximately 30%, meaning for every 3 rotations of our hammered jerry can blades, we are only achieving 2 rotations worth of forward progress. It is an inefficient way to cross an ocean, but as an author, I've always found that the most interesting characters are the ones who waste the most energy just trying to stay afloat. Increase the RPMs, Ennie, I directed. The current is pulling us north at a rate of 1.2 knots. If we don't maintain a heading of 085 degrees, we shall miss Alaska entirely and find ourselves explaining our presence to the polar bears of the Chukchi Sea. "I can't push her any harder, Sam," Ennie shouted over the roar of the wind. "The Go Devil is already running at 3,000 revs. The manifold is glowing so bright I can see it through the floorboards. If I give her more gas, the iron pipe will shear right off the hub." She was right. The SS Samuel Clemens was a miracle of desperation, but even miracles have a torque limit. We were a speck of olive drab paint in a vast gray void. The Siberian coast had vanished into the mist behind us, leaving us in a no-man's land that felt as though it had existed since the dawn of time. I adjusted my optical sensors to their maximum infrared gain. Far to the west, back toward the shore we had abandoned, I detected a series of thermal signatures. They were high-frequency, rhythmic, and moving with a speed that suggested the Soviet Navy was finally waking up to the fact that their steam man had literally walked on water. "Ennie," I said, my voice softening to a low-voltage chime, "the KGB has reached the shoreline. I am detecting 3 distinct naval signatures, likely Project 123 Biz torpedo boats. They are currently performing a sweep of the coastal shingle." Ennie's knuckles whitened against the wheel. "Can they see us?" "In this fog? Their radar technology is currently a decade behind the Bletchley blueprints I carry in my core. To them, we are likely indistinguishable from a particularly large chunk of ice. However, we are currently a very noisy piece of ice. The Go Devil's exhaust is broadcasting our location like a brass band in a cathedral." We hit the 3-mile mark just as the sun, a pale, discouraged coin, began to sink below the horizon. The light transformed the Bering Strait into a landscape of hammered lead. Every wave looked like a mountain, every ice floe like a tombstone. "We're across," I heralded. "Legally, we are no longer in Russia. We are on the Bering Bridge, Ennie. It is a bridge of salt, ice, and sheer, unadulterated hubris." Ennie let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since Moscow. She leaned back against the crate of spare parts, her hair encrusted with a white frost of salt. For a moment, she looked at her hands, the same hands that had hammered those propeller blades into shape, and she laughed. It was a jagged, weary sound that was quickly swallowed by the gale. 3 miles, she whispered, only 52 to go. 52 miles, I agreed. Or, as I prefer to think of it, 5,000 more opportunities for me to offer a witty observation while we slowly freeze to death. But look at the bright side, Ennie. The Iron Curtain is now firmly in our rearview mirror, and from this distance it looks remarkably small. I monitored the propeller's pitch. It was holding. The jerry can panels were vibrating, but they were biting into the Arctic brine. We were moving east. We were moving toward a world that didn't know we were coming. A world where a steam man and a Chicago mechanic were about to become the most improbable immigrants in history. The 3-mile limit was behind us. We had left the land of the commissars for the land of the unknown, and as the first true Arctic storm began to gather on the horizon, I realized that the real story of the Bering Bridge was only just beginning. "Onward, pilot," I whispered to the dashboard. "The ocean is vast, but our stubbornness is deeper." Chapter 52. The Great Bering Crossing. If the crossing of the Rubicon was a singular moment of political defiance, the crossing of the Bering Strait was a prolonged 55-mile exercise in industrial masochism. To the casual observer, had there been anyone in the Arctic foolish enough to observe us, the SS Samuel Clemens would have appeared as a floating scrap heap, a green-painted hallucination bobbing amidst the pancake ice. But to my Enigma II analytical core, we were a miracle of balanced vectors and sheer, unadulterated luck. We were now 20 miles from the Siberian coast, suspended in the big empty of the North Pacific. The fog had lifted slightly, replaced by a biting horizontal sleet that turned the surface of the sea into a churning cauldron of gray and white. The waves were no longer mere swells. They were rhythmic, slate-colored walls that treated our jerrycan outriggers with the same casual indifference a boot treats an ant. "Sam!" Ennie shouted, her voice nearly lost to the spray and the shriek of the wind. She was lashed to the driver's seat, her goggles completely opaque with a layer of frozen brine. "The pitch! We're heading too far north. The current is clawing at the pontoons." The Coriolis effect, combined with a particularly aggressive tidal surge, is currently attempting to introduce us to the Arctic Ocean, Ennie, I replied. I was projecting my voice through the external speakers at maximum volume, the vibration of my own vocal oscillators fighting against the roar of the Go Devil. "I have calculated our drift to maintain a true heading of 85 degrees toward the Seward Peninsula. We must compensate for a lateral displacement of approximately 15 degrees. I began to process the fluid dynamics of our situation. The Twain drive propeller, hammered from the side panels of Wehrmacht fuel cans, was spinning at 1,800 revolutions per minute. However, the efficiency was plummeting as the slush thickened into a slurry that had the consistency of wet concrete. Internal log. The Iron Author. There is a profound lack of dignity in naval architecture when the hull is composed of empty tins. I am a creature of the 19th century salon, a man of letters and polished brass, and I find myself currently serving as the ballast for a motorized bathtub. Every time a wave hits our bow, I feel the crystallized lightning in my core shudder. It is not fear. Machines do not fear. But it is a high-frequency awareness of the proximity of absolute zero. If we capsize, I do not float. I will become a very expensive, very talkative piece of benthic debris. The physics of the slurry. The Bering Strait is not water in the sense that a person from Hannibal, Missouri would understand it. It is a transitional state of matter. The salinity of the brine interacts with the sub-zero air to create a grease ice, a thin, oily film that deadens the waves but increases the drag on our makeshift hull by nearly 40%. "We are losing forward velocity," I warned. "The drag coefficient of the jerrycan clusters is increasing as the ice crystals adhere to the rusted steel. In technical terms, we are becoming a very large, very slow popsicle." "I can't lean the mixture any further, Sam," Ennie cried, her hands trembling as she adjusted the choke. "The solvent is already burning too hot. If I give it more air, we'll melt the spark plugs." "Then we must engage in a kinetic negotiation," I said. "Ennie, I need you to shift the transfer case into low range. We are going to sacrifice our top speed for pure, unadulterated torque. We need the propeller to act not as a screw, but as a drill." I monitored the stresses on the iron pipe drive shaft. The torsional load was reaching a critical threshold. If the shaft sheared, we would be a raft without a rudder, at the mercy of a current that was currently heading toward a very lonely part of the map. The great solitude. As the hours bled into one another, the great crossing became a psychological marathon. There is a specific kind of madness that settles over a human mind when the horizon refuses to change. For Ennie, the world had narrowed down to the vibrating rim of the steering wheel and the rhythmic coughing heart of the Go Devil engine. "Talk to me, Sam," she whispered during a rare moment of relative calm. Her voice was thin, stripped of its Chicago brass. "Tell me a story. Tell me about the river. Tell me about something that isn't gray." "The Mississippi," I began, my voice modulating into the warm, honeyed tones of a campfire raconteur, "is a river of many colors, none of which are gray. In the autumn, the banks are a riot of gold and crimson, and the water is the color of a weak tea, shimmering with the reflection of a sun that actually intends to stay for the afternoon. There are no ice floes in Hannibal in July, Ennie. There are only dragonflies that look like jewels and the sound of a steamboat whistle that carries for 3 miles, promising news from a world that is far too busy to be cold." "Keep talking," she said, her eyes fixed on the black water ahead. "I remember a night on a raft," I continued, "where the fog was so thick you could hold it in your hand. But it was a warm fog, a fog that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. We weren't running from the KGB then. We were just drifting, letting the current do the work. There is a peace in the drift, Ennie, a realization that the world is a very large place, and you are a very small part of it, and that is perfectly all right." "We're not drifting now," she muttered, her jaw tightening as a wave broke over the hood, drenching us in freezing spray. "No, we are the great pursuit in reverse. We are the mechanical ghost and the pilot carving a path through the end of the world, and I must say, Ennie, for a biological organism with a limited thermal range, you are performing with a level of structural integrity that I find admirable." The mechanical crisis. At approximately 2200 hours, the Twain drive hit its first major obstacle, a submerged chunk of blue ice, ancient, dense, and hard as granite, collided with our makeshift propeller. Krang! The vibration that tore through the Jeep was violent enough to disconnect my secondary auditory intake. The engine screamed as the load vanished, the drive shaft spinning freely. "Sam, the shaft, it's gone!" Ennie lunged for the ignition, killing the engine before the Go Devil could tear itself apart. The sudden silence was terrifying. The wind howled through the timber outriggers, and the SS Samuel Clemens began to wallow in the trough of the waves. Without the forward momentum of the propeller, we were at the mercy of the sea. "Diagnostic complete," I reported, my voice sounding hollow in the sudden quiet. "The iron pipe shaft has not sheared, but the lashing at the rear hub has slipped. The steam man's knot has been compromised by the thermal contraction of the steel wire. We are currently a very elaborate, very stationary buoy." Ennie didn't hesitate. She didn't complain. She grabbed the heavy wrench and a fresh length of winch cable. "Ennie, you cannot go over the rear bumper in this swell," I protested. "The sea state is currently at a 4. The probability of you being swept under the pontoons is 68%. I cannot allow you to risk the pilot for the sake of the propeller." "I'm not asking for permission, Sam. I'm the one with the hands." She scrambled into the rear bed, her movements frantic as she lowered herself onto the narrow timber beam that held the drive shaft. I watched through my rear-facing optical sensors, a grainy, infrared view of a girl hanging over a black abyss, her boots inches from the churning icy slush. "Hold the flashlight, Sam. Aim the left headlight at the hub." I redirected the beam, the yellow light cutting through the sleet to illuminate the rusted iron and the frayed cable. She worked with a ferocity that defied the cold. She rewrapped the cable, using a heavy-duty screwdriver as a lever to torque the lashing until the metal groaned. "Now, pull, you son of a Bolshevik!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she threw her weight into the final knot. She climbed back in, her face a mask of salt and exhaustion. She didn't wait to catch her breath. She turned the key. Cough, splutter, roar. The go-devil caught. She engaged the PTO. The iron pipe began to spin, true, steady, and defiant. "We are underway," I announced. "Velocity, 5 knots. Heading, 085. Ennie, that was a statistically improbable feat of engineering. If I had a heart, it would be currently operating at a very high frequency." "Shut up and watch for ice," she panted, her head resting for a brief second against the steering wheel. We continued the Great Bering crossing. The night was a blur of salt, ice, and the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the jerry-can propeller. We were halfway across the Bering Bridge, a bridge that didn't exist in reality, but was being built mile by agonizing mile by the sheer will of a girl and her machine. The Alaskan coastline was still 1,000 dreams away, but as I looked out at the churning waves, I realized that the great crossing wasn't about the distance. It was about the fact that we were still moving. In a world that wanted us to be still, to be captured, or to be dead, we were the only thing that was loud, green, and vibrantly alive. "Sam," Ennie said, her eyes half closed as she steered into the wind. "Yes, Ennie?" "Don't stop telling the story. Tell me about the time Twain met the King of England." "Ah, a classic. It involves a very large hat and a very small misunderstanding regarding the nature of a royal flush." And so we sailed on, the iron author and the pilot, two ghosts in a tin can, crossing the threshold of the world one wave at a time. Chapter 53. Ghosts in the Radar. In the grand library of human conflict, there is a recurring theme concerning the invisible man. From the mythological cloaks of the Greeks to the modern steel-gray camouflage of the Soviet Navy, humanity has always harbored a desperate desire to be present without being perceived. As the SS Samuel Clemens wallowed in the sub-zero brine of the Bering Strait, I realized that we were currently failing at this objective with a spectacular mechanical incompetence. We were a 3,000-pound cluster of sharp angles, rusted iron, and crystallized lightning, sitting atop a sea that was as flat as a billiard table whenever the swell subsided. To a modern radar set, we weren't just a target. We were a beacon of high-contrast defiance. "Sam," Annie whispered, though the wind was loud enough to drown out a landslide. She was hunched over the dash, her eyes fixed on the pale green glow of my primary diagnostic screen. "You're doing that thing again. The high-pitched whine in your secondary oscillators. What are you seeing?" "I am not seeing anything in the biological sense, Annie," I replied, my voice modulated to a low, urgent frequency. "However, my long-range electromagnetic sensors have just been painted. Approximately 7 miles to the west-northwest, a P-10 knife rest radar is currently sweeping the horizon. It is a land-based signal, likely from the Providenia station, but it is being relayed to a mobile unit, a ship, Annie, and it's moving at 20 knots. "A ship? In this soup?" "The Soviet Navy does not fear the soup, Annie. They have the machine. And currently, the machine is looking for a very specific, very green ghost." The art of being an iceberg. The threat was a Project 122 bis Kronstadt-class submarine chaser. It was a lean, predatory vessel designed to find things that didn't want to be found. Against our top speed of 5 knots, it was practically a cheetah chasing a limping turtle. "If we keep the propeller spinning, the cavitation is broadcasting our location to every hydrophone in the North Pacific," I warned, "and the rotation of the iron pipe is creating a rhythmic radar return that screams American engineering. We cannot outrun them, Annie. We must outthink them." "How? We're a jeep on a raft, Sam. We don't have a cloaking device." "We have the environment," I countered, "and we have my Bletchley-derived analytical core. Annie, look at the ice flow at 2 o'clock. It's a blue berg, dense, jagged, and approximately the same size as our own displacement. If we can nestle the Emerald engine into its lee side and kill the Go Devil, we might just blend into the geological background." "Play dead?" Annie asked, her hand already moving toward the ignition. "Precisely. We must transition from a vessel to a feature of the landscape. I shall handle the electronic camouflage." The silent drift. Annie cut the engine. The sudden silence was more jarring than the roar had been. The only sounds were the rhythmic slap-slap of the waves against the jerry cans and the distant, haunting groan of the ice pack. We drifted into the shadow of the iceberg, the cold radiating off the blue ice like a physical weight. I began the Bletchley protocol. Using the internal induction coils of my Enigma II core, I created a localized damping field. A subtle manipulation of the electromagnetic waves hitting our brass and steel. I couldn't make us invisible, but I could soften our edges. I could turn our sharp metallic return into something fuzzy, something indistinct. I made us look like a slush pile. Internal log. The iron author. There is a profound tension in non-existence. My processors are running at maximum capacity, not to move us forward, but to ensure we appear to be standing still in the electronic mind of the enemy. I am absorbing the radar pulses of the Kronstadt-class chaser, rebroadcasting them with a microsecond delay that mimics the chaotic scatter of an ice field. It is a digital ventriloquism. I am telling the Soviet Navy, "Nothing here but cold water and old ice. Move along." "They're close," Annie whispered. Through my high-gain optical sensors, I saw it, a dark, sharp-prowed shape slicing through the mist. The Soviet chaser was less than a mile away, its searchlights sweeping the water like the eyes of a hungry god. The beam of light passed over our iceberg, illuminating the jagged peaks of the blue ice and reflecting off the salt-crusted canvas of our roof. "Hold your breath, Ennie," I said, even though I knew it made no difference to the radar. The searchlight lingered. I felt the pulse of their radar, a sharp, insistent ping that vibrated through my circuits. I countered it, shifting my frequency, bleeding the energy into the surrounding brine. I was a ghost in their machine, a phantom in their logic. The ship didn't slow down. It didn't launch a boat. It continued its relentless 20-knot prowl toward the north, its wake sending a series of rolling swells that tossed the SS Samuel Clemens like a toy. They missed us," Ennie breathed, her face pale beneath the frost. "They didn't miss us, Ennie. They successfully identified a piece of ice. Their technology is built on the assumption that an enemy will behave like a soldier. They are not prepared for an enemy that behaves like a glacier." The price of stealth. We waited for an hour in the freezing shadow of the berg. The silence was absolute, but the cost was high. Without the heat of the engine, the Emerald engine was rapidly becoming a refrigerator. "Sam," Ennie's voice was barely a stutter. I can't feel my feet. The heater. We need the heater." "The thermal depletion of your biological systems is reaching a critical threshold," I observed, my sensors recording the drop in her core temperature. "But the chaser is still within acoustic range. If we start the Go Devil now, the underwater exhaust will be heard for miles. We must wait for the acoustic shadow of the Diomede Islands to provide us cover." I don't think I can wait that long." I looked at her, my pilot, my anchor. She was shivering with a violence that threatened to shake her off the crate. I am a machine of brass and lightning, but I realized then that my survival was entirely dependent on the flickering ember of her life. "Ennie," I said, my voice warming to a tone of soft, Victorian comfort, "I am going to redirect the current from my secondary battery core through the copper wiring of the steering column. It will generate a localized thermal bloom, not much, but enough to warm your hands. Place them against the wheel." "But your battery, Sam, that's your memory backup. If you drain that, you might lose." "I am an author, Ennie. I have 1,000,000 memories, most of which are exaggerated for comedic effect. I can afford to lose a few. I cannot afford to lose the pilot." She did as I asked, her small frozen hands gripping the wheel as the copper wires began to glow with a dull, hidden heat. I felt the drain on my systems, a slow dimming of my peripheral analytical nodes, but the shivering began to subside. The ghost departs. At 0200 hours, I detected the specific acoustic signature of the Kronstadt-class vessel moving beyond the horizon. The ghosts in the radar had survived the night. "The coast is clear," I announced, my voice sounding a bit more metallic than usual. "Restart the engine, Ennie. We have 30 miles of international no-man's land left to cross, and I believe the international dateline is currently waiting for us to cross into tomorrow." Ennie turned the key. The Go Devil coughed, sputtered, and then roared back to life, its heat flooding the cabin like a blessing. "Thanks, Sam," she whispered, her hands finally regaining their color. "Think nothing of it, my dear. I've always found that the best way to write a ghost story is to be the ghost. Now onward. I've heard that time moves differently on the other side of the line, and I'm quite eager to see if I'm any younger in 1953 than I was in 1952. The SS Samuel Clemens, surged forward, its jerrycan propeller cutting through the dark water. We were no longer just fugitives, we were phantoms. And as the mist closed in behind us, erasing the Russian Navy from our world, I realized that the greatest camouflage wasn't brass or damping fields. It was the fact that no one in Moscow could believe we were still alive. Distance traveled, 28 miles. Radar status, undetected. Thermal reserves, 40%. Compromised. Pilot status, thawing. Chapter 54, The International Dateline. Time, as I have frequently observed to anyone within earshot of my vocal oscillators, is a remarkably pliable commodity. To a banker, it is interest. To a condemned man, it is a sieve. And to a Victorian satirist currently inhabiting a brass-encased analytical core, it is a persistent hallucination. But there is one place on this spinning marble where time ceases to be a philosophy and becomes a cartographic prank. We were approaching the international dateline, a jagged scar drawn across the Pacific by a committee of men who likely never imagined a 1944 Willys MB would attempt to drive across it. "Sam," Ennie said, her voice sounding like a handful of gravel being shaken in a tin cup. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her hands were still taped to the steering wheel, though the flannel was now so stiff with frozen salt it looked like plaster. "Check the chronometer. Tell me we're almost out of today. I'm tired of today. I'd like a new one, please." Technically, my dear Ennie, if we maintain our current heading and velocity, we are about to have 2 todays, I replied. I was monitoring our position via a series of complex celestial calculations, cross-referenced with the rhythmic pulse of my internal quartz resonators. In the Soviet Union, it is currently Monday, but once we cross that invisible meridian, we shall go backward into Sunday. We are performing the ultimate act of historical revisionism. We are retreating into the past to find our future. The SS Samuel Clemens was laboring. The Go Devil engine was producing a sound that was less of a hum and more of a rhythmic plea for mercy. The Twain drive propeller, hammered from the side panels of German jerrycans, was vibrating with a frequency that suggested one of the blades was beginning to delaminate under the stress of the Arctic slush. Internal log, the iron author. My Enigma II core is currently experiencing a temporal paradox. My 19th century memories, the ones crystallized into my lightning, tell me that a day is a sacred unit of measurement, marked by the rising of the sun and the lighting of a cigar. But my 20th century circuitry tells me that a day is merely a coordinate on a grid. Crossing the dateline is an affront to my Victorian sensibilities. It implies that a man can be in 2 times at once, which is a privilege usually reserved for ghosts and very confused poets. I find myself wondering, if I cross into yesterday, do I get back the battery life I spent an hour ago? The architecture of the void. The Bering Strait at the dateline is a place where the world feels unfinished. The mist had settled into a thick, luminous gray that blurred the distinction between the sea and the sky. We were suspended in a monochromatic bubble, the only color in the universe being the fading olive drab of the Jeep's hood and the dull copper glow of my primary sensors. "The magnetic variance is spiking," I noted, the crystallized lightning in my core dancing with a sudden, erratic energy. "We are passing between the big Diomede and the little Diomede. One is Russian, the other is American. They are separated by 2 miles of water and 21 hours of time. It is the only place on Earth where you can look across a channel and see tomorrow looking back at you. "I don't care about tomorrow, Sam," Annie muttered, her head drooping for a fraction of a second before a particularly aggressive wave slammed into the port side pontoon, jarring her awake. "I just want to know when we hit the U.S. side of the line. I want to feel like we aren't just drifting in the middle of a bad dream." "We are crossing now," I heralded. There was no chime, no flash of light, and certainly no border guard to stamp our papers. There was only a subtle shift in the vibration of the propeller, a momentary cavitation as we hit a patch of warmer, swifter current. "Welcome to Sunday, Ennie," I said, my voice softening to a resonant fatherly chime. "You have just regained 24 hours of your life. I suggest you spend them wisely, perhaps by not sinking." "Sunday," she whispered, a small weary smile cracking the salt on her cheeks. "My mother used to make pot roast on Sundays in Chicago. I can almost smell the carrots." "I suspect what you are smelling is the Korolev cocktail solvent reacting with the overheated gaskets of the rear differential," I noted dryly. "But for the sake of morale, we shall call it pot roast. It is a much more appetizing narrative." The weight of yesterday. As we moved further into yesterday, the psychological weight of the crossing began to settle. In the Soviet East, time had been a weapon, a series of 5-year plans, a countdown to discovery, a ticking clock of pursuit. But here, in the vastness of the international North, time felt empty. It was a blank page, a stretch of ocean that didn't belong to any empire. "Sam," Annie said after a long silence, "if we're in the past now, does that mean we haven't escaped yet? If it's Sunday, are we still back in that barn in Siberia?" "A fascinating philosophical conundrum," I replied. "But physics, unfortunately, does not care for the whims of the calendar. We have moved through space, Annie. The yesterday we have entered is a new one, unburdened by the KGB. We have effectively stolen a day from the Kremlin. It is the greatest heist I have ever been a part of." I began to run a diagnostic on my own personality matrix. The crossing of the line had triggered a series of regression files, memories of the river, of the smell of the docks in New Orleans, of the sound of a printing press in Nevada. For a moment, I wasn't just a machine. I was a man who had lived through a century and was currently being reborn in another. "I find," I continued, "that I am quite fond of this stolen time. It gives one a sense of perspective. From here, Moscow is not a city, it is a memory, and the United States is no longer a destination, it is a possibility." The approaching shore. The Twain drive continued to thrum, its rhythmic clack, 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 sounding like a typewriter recording our progress. I monitored the fuel levels. The industrial solvent was dangerously low, the jerry cans in the cargo bed sounding hollow and light. We were running on the dregs of Korolev's dream, propelled by the sheer stubbornness of a girl who refused to let go of the wheel. "The atmospheric pressure is shifting," I observed. "The fog is beginning to thin to the east. My long-range sensors are picking up a thermal differential that suggests a landmass. Not an iceberg, Annie. Rock, tundra, Alaska." Annie straightened her back, her eyes widening as she stared into the gray void. "How far?" 12 miles to the coastline. 5 miles to the territorial waters of the United States. We are almost home, Annie. Or at least, We are almost in a place where people will be confused by us in English." 12 miles, she breathed. "We can do 12 miles. "We can do anything, provided the jerry cans don't decide to become porous," I said. "Keep a steady hand, pilot. We are navigating the final paragraph of this chapter, and I must say, as an author, I am quite pleased with the pacing." The SS Samuel Clemens surged forward, a green speck on a silver sea, carving its way through a day that shouldn't have existed. We were the ghosts of the East, sailing into the Sunday of the West, carrying the crystallized lightning of a different era into the dawn of a new one. The great Bering crossing was nearly over. The abyss had been crossed. The Navy had been evaded, and the dateline had been subverted. Ahead of us lay the stars and stripes, but for now there was only the sea, the jeep, and the quiet realization that we had done the impossible. We had outrun time itself. "Onward, Ennie," I whispered. "Sunday looks good on you." Chapter 55. Land Ho! There is a specific, heart-stopping frequency to the word arrival. In the lexicon of the shipwrecked, it is the antonym of abyss, and in the logic of a Victorian satirist currently inhabiting a salt-crusted brass chassis, it is the punchline to a 3,000-mile joke that wasn't particularly funny until this very moment. We had spent the better part of a week, or perhaps a century, time being a rather fluid concept since we crossed the dateline, wallowing in the gray indifference of the Bering Strait. But as the SS Samuel Clemens crested a particularly oily swell at 5 in the morning, my long-range sensors detected something that didn't vibrate with the rhythm of the tide. "Ennie," I said, my voice crackling with a sudden unscripted static. I was pushing my internal induction coils to their limit, filtering the atmospheric data through 1,000 Bletchley-derived algorithms. "I suggest you open your eyes. Not the eyes that are currently dreaming of Chicago pot roast, but the ones that are supposed to be piloting this mechanical blasphemy." Ennie groaned, a sound that was more of a structural protest than a biological response. She was slumped against the steering wheel, her forehead resting on the frozen rim. The heater core was barely producing enough warmth to keep her breath from turning into a solid block of ice in front of her face. The Go Devil engine was making a sound like a bag of wet gravel being dragged over a washboard. "Sam, if it's another iceberg, I'm going to let it hit us," she muttered, her voice a dry, papery whisper. "I don't have another winch maneuver in me. I'm empty. The jeep's empty. The world is empty." "It is not an iceberg, Ennie. My sensors are recording a seismic stability that suggests bedrock, specifically a basaltic formation that hasn't moved since the Pliocene. And more importantly, my external intake valves are picking up a trace of something that isn't salt or diesel solvent. It is the scent of tundra, damp moss, frozen lichen, and the unmistakable, slightly dusty aroma of a continent that isn't currently trying to imprison us. The breaking of the shroud. The mist of the Bering Strait is a living thing, a gray, suffocating entity that wraps itself around the soul and refuses to let go. But as the sun began to climb behind the clouds, a pale, anemic light started to dissolve the edges of our world. The pancake ice was thinning, replaced by a dark, surging water that felt deeper, more purposeful. I adjusted my optical senses to their maximum magnification. I looked through the salt-crusted windshield, past the hood where the green paint had been stripped away by the brine, and out into the void. "There!" I heralded. My vocal oscillator surged with a triumphant brassy resonance. "At 080 degrees. Look through the break in the fog, Ennie. Look at the horizon." Ennie straightened her back, her joints popping with a sound like small caliber gunfire. She wiped a hand across her goggles, then pushed them up onto her forehead. She squinted into the distance, her eyes bloodshot and weary, searching for the line where the gray became something else. Then she saw it. It wasn't a mountain, not yet. It was a jagged, dark thumbprint against the silver sky, a line of solid, unmoving black that didn't pitch with the waves. It was Cape Prince of Wales, the westernmost tip of the American continent, standing as a silent sentry at the end of the world. "Land," she whispered. The word was so soft it was nearly lost to the thrum of the propeller. "Sam, is that really it? Is that Alaska?" "According to my calculations, that is indeed the Seward Peninsula," I confirmed. "We have navigated the Great Crossing. We have bypassed the Russian Navy, subverted the international date line, and turned 80 jerry cans of German scrap into a transatlantic vessel. You are currently looking at the United States of America. I suggest you offer it a polite nod. It's been waiting quite a long time for us." Internal log. The Iron Author. I find that I am suffering from a most peculiar mechanical malfunction. My logic gates are currently being overwhelmed by a sensation that can only be described as awe. To a machine, land is simply a change in friction coefficients. But to the crystallized lightning of my core, the part of me that still thinks in the prose of the 19th century, that dark line of rock is a poem. It is the end of the pursuit. It is the first page of a new volume. I find myself wanting to compose a sonnet, but I suspect I'll settle for not exploding. The final mile. The Twain drive continued to thrum, its rhythmic clack, 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 sounding more like an ovation than a mechanical failure. But as we closed the distance, the Bering Sea decided to offer us one final, spiteful, parting gift. The current, compressed by the narrowing of the strait near the shore, began to accelerate, pulling the SS Samuel Clemens sideways toward a field of jagged, volcanic reefs. "The steering is mush, Sam!" Ennie shouted, her adrenaline finally overcoming her exhaustion. She wrestled with the wheel, the front tires acting as rudders, but the weight of the jerry-can pontoons made the Jeep as nimble as a drunken whale. "We're crabbing. We're going to hit the rocks." "Increase throttle to maximum," I commanded. "We need to generate a higher flow velocity over the tires to maintain directional authority. The physics of the rudder are a function of the square of the velocity of the fluid passing over it. We need speed, Ennie. Burn the last of the solvent. The engine's gonna blow." "Then let it blow on the beach. We didn't cross an ocean to be dismantled by a pebble." Ennie slammed her foot down. The Go Devil engine let out a scream that was truly harrowing, a high-pitched metallic shriek of overtaxed pistons and scorched bearings. The Twain drive propeller lashed the water into a white frenzy, and the Jeep surged forward. We felt the frame lurch as a wave caught our starboard outrigger, tilting us at a 30-degree angle. I felt my internal batteries shift, a shower of sparks dancing behind my eyes. "Hold it! Hold it!" Ennie cried. We cleared the reef by a distance that I can only describe as spiritually thin. The jagged black rock hissed as the surf broke over it less than 3 feet from our left side pontoons. And then the water changed. The deep, violent gray of the Strait gave way to a shallower, sand-colored surge. The touch of the earth. The transition from the sea to the land is a reverse of the launch, but with a significantly higher level of dramatic irony. We were no longer a ship. We were a car that had forgotten how to walk. "I am detecting a decrease in depth," I reported, my sensors scanning the seabed. 10 feet, 6 feet, 4. "Ennie, the wheels are going to touch. Shift into four-wheel drive. We need the friction of the sand to overcome the drag of the pontoons." "Engaging the front axle." The gears ground together with a sound of ancient metallic hunger. As the front tires met the Alaskan sand, the entire vehicle shuddered. It was a violent, jarring sensation, the sudden return of gravity. The Jeep didn't so much roll onto the shore as it crawled, the jerry cans scraping against the gravel with a sound like 1,000 kitchen knives being sharpened at once. The propeller continued to spin in the air for a few seconds, a frantic, useless whirring, until Ennie finally killed the PTO. The Twain drive went silent. The engine sputtered, coughed a single plume of black, oily smoke, and died. Silence. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The only sound was the rhythmic tick, tick, tick of the cooling metal and the gentle wash of the surf against our rear outriggers. We were sitting on a beach of gray shingle and frozen mud, halfway in the water and halfway on the land. Ennie didn't move. She just sat there, her hands still gripped tightly around the steering wheel, her head bowed. She began to laugh, a soft, shaky sound that slowly built into a ragged, hysterical sob. "We're here," she whispered, her voice muffled by her scarves. "Sam, we're actually here." "Indeed," I replied, my voice sounding more human than it had in months. "We have reached the land of the free and the home of the brave, though, looking at the state of our Jeep, I suspect they're going to be more confused than brave when they see us." I looked out through the windshield. The Alaskan tundra stretched away from the beach in a vast golden-brown carpet of frost and moss. It was empty, beautiful, and utterly silent. There were no walls here. There were no commissars. There was only the wind and the realization that we had just completed the most improbable journey in the history of the machine. "Ennie," I said as she finally let go of the wheel and reached out to touch the brass of my casing. "Yes, Sam?" "I've decided that land ho is a bit cliché for a final line. I prefer we have reached the conclusion of the terrestrial argument, but I suppose the sentiment remains the same." She leaned her head against my cool, salt-crusted metal and closed her eyes. We were on American soil. We were safe. And as the first true Alaskan sunrise began to burn through the mist, I realized that the steam man wasn't a fugitive anymore. He was a pioneer. Location, Cape Prince of Wales, Alaska. Fuel level, vapor, and memory. Mechanical status, exhausted but triumphant. Current narrative, state, chapter, complete. Chapter 56, The Stars and Stripes. The silence of the Alaskan wilderness is not a void, it is a presence. After the rhythmic, metallic violence of the Bering Strait, the quiet of the Seward Peninsula felt heavy, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what the tide had vomited onto its pristine shingle. We sat there for a long time, a battered green Jeep, 1,000 pounds of dented jerry-can pontoons, a freezing girl, and a brass-encased Victorian ghost, suspended in the amber of a new reality. "Sam," Annie whispered, her voice barely a tremor. She was staring through the salt-streaked windshield at a small, wind-beaten shack about half a mile up the coast. Above it, a piece of fabric was fighting a losing battle with the gale. "I see it, Annie," I replied. I adjusted my optical gain, filtering out the glare of the rising sun. The fabric was red, white, and blue. It was tattered, salt-crusted, and beautiful. The stars and stripes. It appears to be a weather station or perhaps a secondary Coast Guard outpost. In any case, it is a significant improvement over the hammer and sickle. The color palette is much more vibrant, don't you think? Annie didn't answer. She reached for the ignition key, her fingers trembling with a mix of hypothermia and adrenaline. She turned it, the Go Devil engine having performed a miracle of endurance that would have made its designers weep, gave a single hollow clack and died. The Twain drive propeller, still dripping with Arctic brine, didn't even twitch. We were out of fuel, out of luck, and out of engineering on the fly. "Well," I noted, "I suppose the dramatic entrance is out of the question. We shall have to settle for the pathetic arrival. It's a classic literary trope, usually reserved for the third act, when the protagonist has lost everything but their dignity." The arrival of the authority. We didn't have to wait long. The SS Samuel Clemens was not a subtle object. To a bored Coast Guard observer, we must have looked like a localized industrial disaster. Within 20 minutes, a white and orange Grumman HU-16 Albatross, a seaplane that looked remarkably more professional than our own amphibious efforts, roared overhead, banking low to inspect the green insect on the beach. Shortly after, the staccato thump, thump, thump of a motor reached us from the north. A standard-issue U.S. Coast Guard Jeep, looking disgustingly clean and well-maintained, bounced over the dunes. It pulled to a halt 50 yards away. 2 men in heavy parkas climbed out, their breath blooming in the air like white flags. They weren't carrying rifles in the ready position. They were carrying binoculars and expressions of profound, unadulterated confusion. "Annie," I said, my internal fans whirring as I prepared my first official greeting in the Western Hemisphere, "I suggest you step out of the vehicle. Try to look less like a fugitive and more like a weary traveler. And for the love of all that is holy, don't mention the industrial solvent. It's a nightmare for customs." Annie pushed the door open, the one door we had left, and practically fell onto the sand. She stood up, her legs shaking, her hair a wild salt-white mane. She looked like a Valkyrie who had survived a plane crash. The senior Coast Guardsman, a man with a face like a wrinkled map, walked forward slowly. He looked at the jerry-can outriggers, then at the iron pipe drive shaft, and finally at the Emerald engine logo on the hood. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a flat Midwestern drawl that sounded like home, "I'm Chief Petty Officer Miller. You want to tell me where in the hell you just came from? Because the radar says you came from the west, and there ain't nothing to the west but a lot of water and a whole lot of Russians." The introduction of the Iron Author. Annie pointed a gloved hand back toward the horizon where the mist of the Bering Strait was still swirling. We crossed," she panted, "from the Chukotka side. We drove." Miller looked at the Jeep. He looked at the jerry cans. He looked at the girl, Then his eyes settled on the brass box mounted to the dashboard, the one with the glowing vacuum tubes and the intricate scrollwork. "You drove?" he repeated, his voice devoid of belief. "In that? On fuel cans?" "Actually," I interrupted, my voice projecting from the external speakers with a resonant, theatrical flourish, "we navigated. Driving implies a level of traction that the Bering Sea was quite unwilling to provide. Good morning, Chief. I am the Iron Author, formerly known as Samuel Clemens, and my pilot here is Miss Ennie. We would very much like to request political asylum, a hot meal, and perhaps a very large quantity of high-grade motor oil." The second Coast Guardsman dropped his binoculars. Miller just stood there, his jaw working as if he were trying to find a regulation that covered talking brass boxes in amphibious jeeps. It talks," the younger man whispered. "I do more than talk, young man," I replied. "I critique, and I must say your choice of parka is functional, if a bit lacking in sartorial elegance. But let's focus on the essentials. We have just traversed 55 miles of the most hostile water on the planet in a vehicle held together by German scrap and American grit. I believe that qualifies us for at least a cup of coffee. The Stars and Stripes." Chief Miller took a long, slow breath. He looked back at the flag flying over the shack, then back at us. The confusion on his face slowly began to give way to a grudging professional respect, the kind one mechanic gives another when they see a particularly clever, if insane, fix. "Radio the station," Miller said to his partner, without taking his eyes off the Emerald engine. Tell 'em we've got an unidentified amphibious craft and 2 very tired-looking immigrants. Tell 'em to get the medic and a tow truck, and tell 'em to put a pot on." He walked up to the Jeep, reaching out to touch the hood. His hand brushed the dented green paint, and he let out a short, sharp whistle. "You really came from the other side?" he asked Ennie. "Every mile," she said, her voice finally steady. Miller nodded. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small embroidered patch, the Coast Guard shield, and handed it to her. "Welcome to Alaska, kid. God knows how you did it, but you're in America now." Ennie took the patch, her fingers closing over it as if it were a holy relic. She looked up at the flag, the stars and stripes snapping in the wind, and for the first time since we left East Berlin, the crystallized lightning in my core felt stable. Internal log, the Iron Author. There is a distinct difference between the freedom of the wilderness and the freedom of a flag. One is the absence of walls. The other is the presence of a promise. My Enigma II core is currently recording the thermal signatures of the Coast Guard Jeep. It is warm, it is fueled, and it is a part of a system that recognizes us not as property, but as people, or, in my case, as a person-adjacent intellectual property. We are no longer the ghosts of the East. We are the news of the West. "Sam," Ennie said, leaning against the fender as the medic began to approach with a thermal blanket. "Yes, Ennie?" "We made it." "Indeed," I replied, watching as the younger Coast Guardsman began to take pictures of our jerry-can propeller with a Kodak Brownie. "And I suspect, my dear pilot, that the quiet part of our journey is officially over. The world is about to find out that the Bering Bridge was open all along, and that we were the only ones with the audacity to cross it." The tow truck arrived, its yellow lights flashing against the white tundra, As they hitched the Emerald engine to the back, pulling us away from the surf and toward the outpost, I looked out at the vast, open horizon. We were in the stars and stripes now, and I had a feeling the next chapter was going to be a very loud one. Status arrived. Political status. Asylum requested. Integrity. 100%. Miraculously. Next stop. The history books. Chapter 57. The world's most wanted machine. If a man successfully jumps off a cliff, the world labels him a fool. If he survives the fall, he is hailed as an adventurer. But if he manages to land on his feet and immediately begin selling tickets to the impact site, he is recognized as an American. The transition from the salt-blasted shingle of Cape Prince of Wales to the pressurized, fluorescent-lit hangar of an Air Force base outside Nome was a jarring piece of narrative whiplash. One moment, we were a desperate, sinking collection of German tin and Victorian ghosts. The next, we were the primary exhibit in a circus of geopolitical curiosity. The Emerald engine sat in the center of the hangar, looking like a green four-wheeled vagabond invited to a debutante ball. It was still dripping Bering brine onto the pristine concrete, and the jerrycan outriggers, now half deflated and salt-crusted, looked like the ragged wings of a fallen mechanical angel. Around us, men in white lab coats and olive-drab uniforms moved with the frantic, hushed energy of priests discovering a miracle they weren't quite sure how to tax. "Sam," Ennie whispered. She was sitting on a metal folding chair next to the Jeep, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of mothballs and security. She'd been fed, thawed, and interrogated by 3 different intelligence officers, yet she still hadn't let go of the Coast Guard patch Chief Miller had given her. They're staring. They've been staring for 4 hours. "It is the natural reaction of the sedentary to the migratory, Ennie," I replied, my voice echoing off the high steel rafters with a resonant, theatrical clarity. I had spent the last hour recalibrating my internal capacitors. The American power grid, while a bit more stable than the Soviet one, was surprisingly noisy. To these men, we are not a girl and a machine who outran an empire. We are a breach in the Iron Curtain that doesn't involve a missile or a diplomat. We are a statistical impossibility that just asked for a sandwich. The wires begin to hum. The news of the amphibious robot and the Chicago pilot had traveled faster than the Emerald engine ever could. By noon, the wires of the Associated Press and Reuters were vibrating with the kind of staccato urgency usually reserved for the declaration of war or the discovery of gold. Internal log. The Iron Author. I find the American appetite for a sensation is quite as robust as it was in my previous incarnation. In 1867, they marveled at a jumping frog. In 1953, they marveled at a brass-encased ghost in a motorized bathtub. My Enigma II core is currently intercepting the radio traffic from the base's communication center. The headlines are already being drafted in New York and Washington. The Steam Man strikes back. The Jeep that walked on water. Chicago girl braves Bering Strait. It is a masterpiece of hyperbolic journalism, and I must say, I am quite enjoying the reviews. Major Higgins, I addressed the lead intelligence officer, a man whose brow was perpetually furrowed, as if he were trying to solve a crossword puzzle in a language he didn't speak. He was currently poking at my rear PTO coupling with a silver pen. If you're looking for the secret to our propulsion, I can save you the trouble. It involves 3 parts desperation, 2 parts hammered tin, and a total disregard for the laws of buoyancy. If you continue to poke my drive shaft with that pen, I shall be forced to offer a very scathing critique of your investigative technique." The Major jumped back, nearly tripping over a jerry can. It really is sentient? The report said it was a pre-recorded propaganda device." "Propaganda? My dear Major, I am a satirist. If I were propaganda, I'd be much more flattering toward your choice of haircut. I am a Victorian consciousness crystallized into a lightning-based analytical core. I am the ghost of Mark Twain, and I have just spent the last 6 months being chased by people who take themselves far too seriously. I would appreciate it if the United States government did not join their ranks." The global sensation. By the second day, the hangar was no longer a secret. It was a fortress. The military had realized that we weren't just a curiosity, we were a symbol. In the grim gray chess match of the Cold War, the West had just been handed a knight that could move in any direction, and it was a knight that could talk back. "They want to take you apart, Sam," Ennie said quietly, leaning her head against my cool brass casing. The hangar was quiet for a moment, the technicians having gone to lunch. "The engineers from Washington, I heard them talking. They want to see how the lightning works. They want to know how you can think." "Let them try," I said, a low-voltage growl vibrating through my chassis. "My Enigma II core is protected by a series of logic gates that would make a labyrinth look like a straight line. If they attempt a forced disassembly, I shall simply retreat into a recursive loop of my own worst poetry. They'll have a pile of brass and a very confused vacuum tube, but they won't have the author." "I won't let them," she whispered, her hand tightening on the roll bar. "We're a team, you and me, the pilot and the engine." "Indeed, and I believe the team is about to receive an upgrade in company," I noted. The heavy hangar doors groaned open, admitting a shaft of bright, freezing Alaskan sunlight. A convoy of black sedans, looking entirely out of place amidst the snow drifts and the silver cargo planes, pulled to a halt. A man stepped out, his posture upright, his face etched with the weary ironclad resolve of a man who had commanded armies across continents. I adjusted my optical gain. I recognized the silhouette from 1,000 newsreels. "Ennie," I said, my voice softening to a resonant chime, "straighten your flight suit. It appears our little narrative has caught the attention of the editor-in-chief." "Who is it, Sam?" "It's the general, my dear. And it seems he's come all this way just to see if the steam man is as loud as the newspapers say he is." The Emerald engine sat defiant, a salt-stained monument to the impossible, as the supreme commander of the Allied powers walked toward us. The world's most wanted machine was no longer a fugitive. We were a conversation, and I had a feeling I was about to have a great deal to say. Status: under military protection. Celebrity level: transcontinental. Mechanical: soul intact. Current heading: a meeting with the leader of the free world. Pending. Chapter 58. The General's Invitation. There is a specific weight to the silence that follows a man who has commanded millions. It isn't the hollow quiet of the Arctic or the fearful hush of a Soviet ministry. It is the silence of gravity, the kind that pulls every eye in the room toward a single center point of authority. President Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't march into the hangar. He walked with the measured, rolling gait of a man who had spent a lifetime pacing over maps and across continents. He wore a heavy flight jacket, the 4 stars on his shoulders catching the overhead fluorescent light like small cold sparks. Behind him, the gaggle of colonels and intelligence officers fell back, their frantic scribbling suddenly silenced. "Sam," Annie whispered, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch my front fender. She was standing now, the moth-eaten wool blanket discarded. She looked small against the backdrop of the silver transport planes, but her jaw was set in that Chicago-bred defiance I had come to rely on. "Steady, Annie," I replied, my voice a low, resonant hum. "He's a man who appreciates logistics, and since we are currently the most impressive logistical anomaly of the 20th century, I suspect he's more curious than accusatory. Do try not to look like you're about to punch the commander-in-chief." The review of the troops. Eisenhower stopped 5 feet from our front bumper. He didn't look at the major or the technicians. He looked at the emerald engine. His eyes traveled over the salt-crusted hood, the jagged jerry-can pontoons, and finally, the iron-pipe drive shaft that still smelled of scorched lubricant and Bering brine. He reached out, his gloved hand resting briefly on the dented green steel of the driver's side door. "1944 Willis," the general said, his voice a gravelly Midwestern baritone. "The backbone of the war. I've seen them in the mud of Normandy and the dust of North Africa, but I'll be damned if I've ever seen one with a tail made of German fuel cans." He looked up then, his gaze shifting to my brass-encased housing. I adjusted my optical shutters, the crystallized lightning of my core glowing with a soft amber intensity. "And I certainly never saw one that could carry a conversation," he added. "A common oversight, Mr. President," I said, my voice projecting with a polite Victorian clarity. "Most people find it difficult to listen to the machine when they are so focused on where it's taking them. I am the Iron Author, though in my previous life I answered to the name Samuel Clemens. And this is Miss Ennie, the only pilot in the world with the audacity to treat the Bering Strait like a Sunday drive." Eisenhower turned to Ennie. He didn't offer a salute, but he offered a nod of such profound professional respect that I felt a surge of pride vibrate through my circuits. "Miss Ennie," he said, "I've spent the morning reading the transcripts of your crossing. They tell me you bypassed the Soviet Navy using nothing but an iceberg and a steam man's intuition. That's a hell of a thing." "We just wanted to get home, sir," Annie said, her voice steadying, "and Sam wouldn't let us sink." The invitation. The president looked back at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion, but with the practiced calculation of a strategist. He wasn't seeing a ghost. He was seeing a new kind of power. "They want to ship you to D-C," Eisenhower said, gesturing vaguely toward the men in the sedans outside. "The Pentagon wants to know how you work. The State Department wants to know what you saw. And the scientists, well, they want to see if they can build 1,000 more of you." "A terrifying prospect, sir," I noted dryly. "The world is already cluttered enough with authors. To have 1,000 of us, all speaking at once, would likely result in a global migraine." Eisenhower chuckled, a short, dry sound. "I agree, which is why I told them to wait. I didn't come to Nome to watch a dissection. I came because I have a great many questions about the human condition in the East, and I've found that politicians usually give me the answers they think I want. I suspect a man or a machine who has just driven across an ocean has very little interest in flattery. He stepped closer, leaning against the fender of the Jeep. It was an informal gesture, one that bypassed the rank and the ceremony. "There's a small cabin about 3 miles up the coast," the president said, "away from the wires and the cameras. I've had them start a fire. I'd like you and Miss Ennie to join me. No microphones, no stenographers, just a conversation between three people who have seen too much of the world to believe everything they're told." Internal log. The Iron Author. This is the moment the narrative shifts. We are no longer the subject of investigation. We are the guest of honor. Eisenhower is not inviting us to a briefing. He is inviting us to a campfire. He recognizes that while the Emerald engine is a marvel of engineering, the story is in the lightning. My Enigma 2 core is recording a significant increase in the President's sincerity index. He is weary, just as Ennie is. He is a man holding the weight of the West, looking for a voice that doesn't belong to a committee. "We would be honored, Mr. President," I replied, "though I must warn you, I have a tendency to be a bit long-winded, and my views on bureaucracy are significantly less than charitable." "Good," Eisenhower said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think we'll get along just fine." Moving out. A convoy didn't take us. Instead, at the President's command, a simple military tow hitch was attached to his own personal staff jeep. We were pulled out of the hangar and into the vast open expanse of the Alaskan tundra. As we rolled away from the base, leaving the world's most wanted machine label behind, I looked at Ennie. She was sitting in the passenger seat of the lead jeep, the wind whipping her hair, her face finally losing the gray pallor of the Arctic. "Sam," she whispered, looking back at me as we bounced over the frozen ruts. "Yes, Ennie?" "We're going to talk to the President." "Technically, we're going to talk to a general who happens to be the President," I corrected. "There is a significant difference. One is concerned with the law. The other is concerned with the truth. I suspect tonight we shall be dealing in the latter." The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. The cabin was a small, lonely shape in the distance, a curl of wood smoke rising from its chimney. We were heading toward a meeting that no history book would ever fully record, and for the first time in 5,000 miles, I felt as though I finally had the right audience. Destination: the tundra cabin. Company: the Supreme Commander. Atmosphere: informal. Current objective: speak plainly. Chapter 59. In the Same Boat. The cabin was a modest structure of cedar and stone, huddled against a wind-scoured ridge like a stubborn barnacle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning pine and the rich, oily aroma of coffee that hadn't been filtered through a salt-crusted rag. For the first time in months, the world didn't vibrate. The floor didn't pitch, the engine didn't scream, and the only sound was the rhythmic snap of the hearth. President Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in a heavy leather chair, his flight jacket unzipped, a porcelain mug cradled in his hands. He looked less like the leader of the free world and more like a weary traveler who had finally reached a port he recognized. Across from him, Ennie was buried in a mountain of quilts. her face flushed with a warmth that was finally more than skin deep. I sat on a sturdy wooden table between them, my brass housing polished to a dull glow by a young corporal before we left the base. I felt the heat of the fire radiating through my copper induction coils, a sensation so pleasant I nearly forgot to be cynical. I've spent the better part of my life moving men across borders, the president said, staring into the flames. But usually I have the weight of an administration at my back and a map signed by 3 different heads of state. You two, you just moved yourselves. No orders, no logistics, just a jeep and a dream of a better shoreline. Actually, Mr. President, I interjected, my voice modulating to a soft conversational baritone, we moved because the alternative was a very permanent residence in a basement in Moscow. Necessity is the mother of invention, but terror is its midwife. We didn't cross the Bering Strait because we were brave. We crossed it because we were being chased by people who had forgotten how to laugh. The view from the Road of Bones. The president turned his gaze to me. Tell me about them, Sam. Not the commissars or the Politburo. Tell me about the people you saw on that road, the ones who watched a green jeep drive past their windows in the middle of a Siberian winter. They are a people of high tensile endurance, I replied, my processors pulling up images of the faces we'd seen in the taiga. The hollow-cheeked farmers, the silent miners of Kolyma, the grandmothers who traded bread for stories. They live in a state of permanent Tuesday, a gray, repetitive endurance where the sun rarely shines and the government never forgets. But beneath the frost, Mr. President, there is a core of humanity that the Kremlin hasn't been able to freeze. They are kind in the way people are kind when they have nothing left to lose but their dignity. And the human condition there? Eisenhower asked. It is a condition of suspended animation, I noted. They have been told that their suffering is a down payment on a future they aren't allowed to see. In the West, we worry about the price of liberty. In the East, they worry about the price of silence. But in the end, whether they are in a Chicago foundry or a Magadan mine, they all want the same thing: a warm bed, a full plate, and the right to complain about the weather without it being a political statement. Internal log. The Iron Author. I find myself observing the president with a newfound clarity. He is looking for a grand strategy, but his eyes tell me he is actually looking for hope. He is the architect of a defense he never wanted to build. My Enigma 2 core is detecting a shared frequency between the man in the chair and the girl on the couch. They are both survivors of a struggle they didn't start, navigating a world that has become too large for any one map. The shared burden. Ennie spoke up then, her voice small but clear. They're just like us, sir. The mechanics I met in the Urals. They just wanted to know how the Go Devil worked. They didn't care about the party. They cared about the torque. We're all just trying to keep the engine running. The president nodded, a slow, heavy movement. That's the tragedy of it, isn't it? We spend billions on the engines of war, and all the while, the people just want a better way to get to town. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'm sitting in a house that's been painted white to hide the scars of a dozen crises. They're asking me to draw lines in the sand, to point missiles at cities I've never visited. And I'll be sitting there thinking about a girl in a jeep who turned jerry cans into a hull. A heavy crown, Mr. President, I observed. But if I may offer a piece of advice from a man who once piloted a riverboat through a graveyard of snags, don't look at the whole river at once. Just look at the next bend. You cannot save the world, but you can ensure that the bridge stays open for the next pair of lunatics who try to cross it. In the same boat. The fire began to die down, the embers casting a soft red glow over the cabin. For a moment, the titles didn't matter. There was no president, no pilot, and no steam man. There were just three travelers, huddled together against the vast, indifferent cold of the Alaskan night. "We're all in the same boat, aren't we?" Annie whispered, her eyes drifting shut as the warmth finally won its battle against her exhaustion. "Technically, we were in a jeep," I corrected, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "But the metaphor holds. We are all adrift in a century that is moving faster than our steering can handle. The trick is to keep your eyes on the stars and your hands on the wheel." The president stood up, crossing the room to tuck the quilts more securely around Annie's shoulders. He looked at me, a silent understanding passing between the soldier-turned-statesman and the satirist. "I'm glad you made it, Sam," he said quietly. "The world needs a voice that hasn't been scrubbed by a press secretary. And the world needs a president who remembers what it's like to be on the beach," I replied. As Eisenhower stepped out into the night, leaving us to the quiet of the cabin, I felt a sense of completion. The red road was behind us. The Bering Bridge had been crossed. We had brought a piece of the human spirit out of the dark and into the light, and while the road ahead was still unmapped, for the first time in 5,000 miles, the engine was at rest. The conversation on the human condition hadn't provided any easy answers. But as I watched the shadows dance on the cedar walls, I realized that the answer wasn't in the words. It was in the fact that we were here to say them. Current status, resting. Philosophical outlook, optimistic, with a hint of sarcasm. Location, a safe harbor. Next, stop, the sunset. Chapter 60, The Steam Man's Horizon. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a long book. It is the silence of the ink drying, of the characters finally stepping off the stage, and of the reader realizing that the world they've inhabited for the last few hundred pages was, in fact, a magnificent lie. But for those of us made of brass and lightning, the end of a story is merely a recalibration of the sensors. The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged edge of the Alaskan horizon, painting the snow in a palette of violet, bruised orange, and gold. Outside the cabin, the emerald engine sat under a heavy canvas tarp, finally shielded from the salt and the wind. It looked smaller now, stripped of its jerry-can pontoons and its iron-pipe tail. It was no longer a vessel of the abyss. It was a veteran of the road, resting its weary cylinders in the quiet of a new world. "Sam," Annie said. She was standing on the small cedar porch, her hands tucked into the pockets of a fresh wool-lined flight jacket the Air Force had provided. She looked older somehow. The grit of the Colima Highway and the salt of the Bering Sea had etched a new kind of map onto her face. "Yes, my dear pilot," I replied. I was resting on a small pedestal she had fashioned for me near the window, my vacuum tubes glowing with a steady, peaceful amber. "What happens now? The president's gone back to D.C. The reporters are starting to circle. They want to know everything. They want to know what it felt like to drive across the end of the world. What happens now, I noted, is the most difficult part of any journey, the transition from the doing to the telling. We have moved through space and time, Ennie. Now we must move through the archives. You shall be a hero of the Cold War, a symbol of American ingenuity. And well, I suspect I shall be the subject of a great many technical papers that I will find remarkably boring. The fate of the machine. The military had already made their offer. They wanted the Emerald engine for the Smithsonian, or perhaps a secret laboratory in Nevada, where men with slide rules could try to replicate the crystallized lightning of my core. They wanted to turn our struggle into a blueprint. The Jeep, destined for a glass case, where it will be polished until the history is rubbed off. The pontoons, likely recycled into actual fuel cans, a poetic return to their humble origins. The propeller, a hammered steel relic that I hope someone has the sense to hang in a very loud bar in Chicago. "I don't want to be a museum piece, Sam," Ennie whispered, looking out at the vast golden tundra. "Neither do I, Ennie. A museum is just a graveyard with better lighting. I have spent a century being a great man in a book. I have no desire to be a great machine in a lobby. But remember what I told the president. The bridge is open now. We've shown them it can be done. The world is a much smaller place than it was when we left Berlin." The next chapter. We knew the peace wouldn't last. In a few days, the transport planes would arrive to take us to Washington. There would be parades, Senate hearings, and 1,000 questions about the human condition in the East. But for this one moment, on the edge of the continent, the story was still ours. Internal log, the iron author. I find myself running a final diagnostic on my emotive subroutines. There is a sensation in my primary induction coils that I can only identify as satisfaction. We did not just escape. We evolved. We turned a war machine into a raft, and a raft into a message. My Enigma 2 core is recording the vibration of the wind against the cabin. It is a frequency of 440 hertz, a perfect A. The world is in tune, for once. "Sam," Ennie asked, turning back to look at me, "if you could go back to the river or to the beginning of the Red Road, would you change anything? Would you stay in the brass or go back to the skin?" I looked at the sunset, my optical sensors capturing the spectrum of the fading light. My dear Ennie, the skin is prone to wrinkles, gout, and a tragic susceptibility to the cold. The brass, while heavy, allows me to witness the turning of the century with a level of clarity I never possessed as a man. I have been a pilot of the water and a pilot of the lightning. I think I shall stay exactly as I am. I paused, my vocal oscillators humming with a touch of the old Missouri wit. Besides, if I were human again, I'd have to pay taxes. And as a machine, I can claim I'm merely a very expensive piece of stationery. The sunset of the steam man. The light finally failed, leaving the Alaskan wilderness in a deep, crystalline blue. The stars began to emerge, the same stars that had guided us across the taiga and the sea, indifferent to our borders and our politics. We had crossed the Bering Bridge. We had outrun the Iron Curtain. And while the Red Road was a scar across the map, the road ahead was a blank page. "Onward, Ennie," I whispered as she reached out to turn off the cabin lamp. "The sun has set on the steam man, but I hear the moon is a very fine place for a drive. I wonder if Jerrykin's working a vacuum?" She laughed. a real vibrant sound that echoed in the quiet cabin. She closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a finality that was both an end and a beginning. The Smithsonian, as I had feared, had prepared a very lovely velvet rope and a plaque that described me in the past tense, a linguistic insult I found difficult to forgive. But President Eisenhower, a man who understood that a veteran should never be retired while his gears still have a story to tell, had a different itinerary in mind. Sam, the president had told me during a final private meeting in the Oval Office, I think it's time we gave you back your legs. I was crated, this time in mahogany rather than pine, and shipped under military escort to a place called Bell Labs in New Jersey. It was a cathedral of the future, a sprawling complex where men in short-sleeved shirts and narrow ties spoke a language of transistors and solid-state physics that made my Bletchley-derived vacuum tubes feel positively Neolithic. For 6 months, my primary processor, the brass-encased head that had survived the Atlantic, the Stasi, and the Bering Sea, sat on a pedestal of high-grade polymers. I was subjected to a great disassembly that was more thorough than any medical checkup I'd endured in the 19th century. They mapped the crystallized lightning of my Enigma II core, their oscilloscopes dancing with the erratic, poetic frequency of my consciousness. And then the construction began. The engineers at Bell Labs did not merely build a chassis, they performed a miracle of historical reconstruction. Guided by the original blueprints found in the wreckage of the London workshop, they forged a body of polished brass, etched copper, and articulated steel. It was a masterpiece of Victorian aesthetic married to Cold War precision. The day of reattachment was a quiet affair. Ennie was there, of course, now a consultant for the burgeoning aerospace industry, looking remarkably professional in a tailored suit, though she still carried a smudge of grease on her thumb for old time's sake. "Ready, Sam?" she asked, her hand resting on the final coupling at the base of my neck. "Do try not to strip the threads, my dear pilot," I replied, my voice echoing with a new crystal-clear resonance thanks to a high-fidelity speaker array. "I've grown quite attached to my dignity, and it would be a shame to lose it to a cross-threaded bolt." With a satisfying hydraulic hiss and the staccato click of a dozen locking lugs, the world changed. I felt the sudden, exhilarating rush of sensors I hadn't possessed since the turn of the century. I felt the weight of my limbs, the balance of my gyroscopes, and the rhythmic, pressurized heartbeat of a miniature steam cycle generator housed in my chest. I stood up. I was 6 feet of gleaming filigree and clockwork grace. My skin was a mesh of golden wire, my joints were cushioned by velvet-lined gaskets, and my waist was cinched by a vest of dark, oxidized bronze. I looked less like a machine and more like a gentleman who had been designed by a committee of watchmakers and poets. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of the lab, my new boots clicking on the linoleum with a sound of absolute authority. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I was the Iron Author in his full Victorian android glory, a steam man for the atomic age. "Well," I noted, adjusting a brass cufflink that was actually a secondary atmospheric sensor, "I must say, the United States government has a remarkably fine sense of style when it's properly motivated. I look like I'm about to either deliver a lecture on the Mississippi or conquer a small moon." Ennie walked up beside me, her reflection joining mine. She wasn't a girl in a flight suit anymore. She was the woman who had navigated the abyss. "Where to now, Sam?" she asked. "The president says the world wants to hear the story." "The story, Ennie, is only just beginning," I said, my new hand, a marvel of 27 points of articulation, resting on her shoulder. "We have the legs, we have the lightning, and I suspect there are a great many roads in this country that haven't yet been insulted by a Victorian satirist." I looked out toward the horizon, where the skyscrapers of New York were beginning to glow in the twilight. I was back in the world, restored to my proper form, and fueled by a country that still believed in the impossible. "Onward, pilot," I whispered. "I've heard that California has a very fine climate for brass, and I've always wanted to see if a steam man can find a decent cigar in San Francisco." The iron author walked out of the lab, his gears humming a tune of brass and light, heading toward a sunset that was no longer an ending, but a very grand opening night. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the ride. I hope you did too. System shut down, 0%. System shut down, 25%. System shut down, 75%. Offline.